The unwanted house guest I recently moved into a new apartment. It's nothing special, just a small one-bedroom in a quiet neighborhood. But for the price, I couldn't complain. The previous tenant moved out pretty quickly, which I thought was a little strange, but I figured maybe they had to relocate for work or something. I was excited for a fresh start, but things started to feel off pretty soon after I settled in. At first, it was little things. I'd come home from work and find the kitchen cabinet slightly open, or the TV remote in a different spot than where I left it. I assumed I was just being forgetful or distracted. Moving in can be hectic, right? But as the days went on, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone else had been in my apartment. One evening, I got home from work and found my keys lying on the kitchen counter. The problem? I always leave them in my jacket pocket by the door. It didn't make sense, but I brushed it off. Maybe I had absent-mindedly moved them earlier and just didn't remember. Still, the uneasiness stuck with me. A few nights later, I was lying in bed, just about to drift off, when I heard a noise. It wasn't loud, just the sound of a cabinet creaking open in the kitchen. My heart started racing. I grabbed a flashlight and crept out of bed, tiptoeing down the hall. By the time I reached the kitchen, the noise had stopped. All the cabinets were shut, just like I'd left them. I stood there, staring at the room, trying to figure out if I'd imagined the whole thing. The next morning, I started locking all the doors and windows religiously before bed. But it didn't help. Every morning, something would be different. A drawer half open, the lights on in the living room, or an appliance running that I hadn't touched in days. It was like someone was coming in at night, but there was no sign of forced entry. I even asked the landlord if anyone else had a key. He said no. That's when I decided to install a camera in the living room. If someone was sneaking into my place, I'd catch them. I set it up before bed and slept uneasily, hoping it would catch something, anything. The next morning, I checked the footage, and what I saw made my blood run cold. The camera had recorded me, but not just me sleeping. It showed me walking around the apartment in the middle of the night, my eyes half open, like I was in a trance. I had no memory of this. I've never sleepwalked before in my life. But there I was, sitting on the couch for hours, staring blankly at the wall before getting up and walking back to bed. I told myself it had to be stress or exhaustion, but deep down, I knew that wasn't it. I became paranoid. During the day, I felt like I was being watched. Every time I heard a creak or a knock, my heart jumped. I couldn't focus at work. At night, I tried staying awake to see if anything would happen, but nothing did. The nights I stayed awake, everything stayed normal. But whenever I drifted off, I'd wake up to more strange footage. I kept checking all the doors and windows, but there was never any sign of someone getting in. Yet, I continued to wake up to the same unsettling disturbances. Random things out of place, lights I didn't turn on, the TV playing static at full volume in the middle of the night. It was getting worse. My head was spinning. I felt like I was losing control, losing my grip on reality. Then, one morning, I woke up to find every single cabinet in the kitchen wide open. There was a note on the counter written in my own handwriting, "You won't stop me." But I had no memory of writing it. That night, I forced myself to sleep. Maybe if I faced whatever was happening head-on, it would stop. I woke up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, with the overwhelming sensation that someone was in the room. I froze. My eyes slowly adjusted to the darkness, and at the foot of my bed, there was a figure standing still. I couldn't move. My phone was on the nightstand, just out of reach, but I finally managed to grab it and turn on the flashlight. The light cut through the dark, and there was nothing there. I scrambled out of bed, breathing hard, and checked the camera footage immediately. No one had entered the apartment, and the footage didn't show anyone standing in my room. but the fear lingered. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself it was just a hallucination from sleep deprivation. But that didn't explain why I felt watched, constantly watched, like something was always just out of sight, waiting. The next night, it happened again. I woke up to that same feeling, someone standing in my room. This time, I heard whispering. I grabbed my phone, and as I turned on the flashlight, the whispering stopped. I checked the footage in the morning, and the camera showed something even worse than before. It showed me, sitting up in bed, staring directly at the camera for hours. I had no memory of it. That was the breaking point. I couldn't stay there any longer. I packed my bags and left, convinced that I had to get out. On my way out the door, I checked the footage one last time. There I was again, standing at the foot of my own bed, staring at myself as I slept. I moved out the next day. I haven't had any strange experiences since, but I still think about that apartment. The feeling of being watched, the loss of control, it's hard to forget. Sometimes I still get notifications from the camera app, even though I've deleted the footage and stopped using it. Motion detected. And the apartment is supposed to be empty. The mysterious hitchhiker. I've always been the type who enjoys late-night drives. There's something calming about the open road, especially when the world feels quiet. I've done this countless times, just me, my car, and the sound of tires on the highway. This story, though, isn't about one of those peaceful drives. It's about the night I picked up a hitchhiker, and I've been replaying the events in my head ever since, trying to understand what really happened. I don't know if I'll ever figure it out. It was around midnight, and I was on a stretch of highway that I knew well. No streetlights, just miles of empty road. I was the only car in sight. I remember feeling at ease at first, but then small things started to bother me. My dashboard light flickered a few times, which was weird, but I figured it was just a wiring issue. Then, a car that had been following me for a while suddenly disappeared without passing me. It was strange, but I told myself I was overthinking things. That's when I saw him. A hitchhiker, standing by the side of the road, slowly waving. Normally, I wouldn't stop. I've seen enough movies to know better, but for some reason, I did. Maybe it was the way he looked. Young, maybe late 20s, scruffy, but not threatening. Or maybe it was just the empty road ahead, stretching on for miles. Against my better judgment, I pulled over. He thanked me as he got in, and I could tell he was relieved. We made some small talk, and he seemed friendly enough at first. He said his name was Alex, and that he'd been walking for hours after his car broke down. I felt a little better. We've all been stuck on the side of the road at some point, right? But as we kept driving, his questions started to get personal. It began innocently. Where are you headed? Do you drive this road a lot? But then he asked if I lived alone, if anyone knew I was on this trip. It caught me off guard. I laughed it off, but his tone was different now, darker. He mentioned how empty the highway was, how anything could happen out here and no one would know. That's when I started regretting my decision to pick him up. The more we talked, the more uncomfortable I became. He asked about my family, whether I locked my doors at night. I gave vague answers, trying to steer the conversation in a different direction, but he wouldn't let it go. There was something unsettling in the way he looked at me, like he was sizing me up. My mind raced with possibilities. Was he dangerous, or was I just overreacting? I wanted to get rid of him, but we were in the middle of nowhere. There wasn't even a gas station for miles. I suggested stopping when we came across one, but he shrugged it off, saying he didn't mind staying on the road for a bit longer. I felt trapped in my own car. That's when I noticed it. He was fidgeting with something in his jacket. At first I couldn't make it out, but then I saw it. A knife. It wasn't drawn, but the sight of it made my stomach drop. My grip on the steering wheel tightened, and I tried to keep my breathing steady. I told myself I was being paranoid, that maybe it was just a tool or something, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was in real danger. Without warning, he pulled the knife out. My heart pounded in my chest. But instead of attacking, he held it up, looking at me with wide eyes. "I didn't mean to scare you," he said, his voice shaky. I just carry it for protection." He quickly put it back in his jacket, mumbling an apology. I didn't know what to say. I just kept driving, my mind racing. Was he messing with me, or was he genuinely sorry? The rest of the ride was tense. He didn't say much after that, and neither did I. The silence was almost worse than the conversation. All I could hear was the hum of the engine and the sound of the tires on the asphalt. I kept glancing at him from the corner of my eye, waiting for him to do something, anything. Every minute felt like an hour. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw a gas station up ahead. I casually mentioned that I needed to stop for gas, and he nodded, almost too calmly. As I pulled into the station, the bright lights felt like a lifeline. I stopped the car, waiting for him to make a move. I half expected him to pull the knife out again, but he didn't. Instead, he opened the door, stepped out, and started walking toward the darkness beyond the gas station. He didn't say a word. He didn't look back. He just disappeared into the night. I sat there for a minute, trying to process what had just happened. Part of me felt relieved. He was gone, and I was still here, unharmed. But another part of me couldn't shake the feeling that I just narrowly escaped something terrible. What if he had meant to use that knife? What if I'd said the wrong thing or reacted differently? Was I just lucky, or was it all in my head? I drove off, but the fear stayed with me. Every shadow on the road felt threatening. Every movement in the corner of my eye made me jump. Even though he was gone, I couldn't stop thinking about what could have happened. I never saw him again. No one did, as far as I know. But I still think about that night. Did I narrowly escape something awful? Or was he just a troubled guy looking for a ride? I'll never know. That uncertainty, it's the worst part. Now, every time I drive at night, I find myself looking over my shoulder, wondering if I'll ever run into someone like him again. And honestly, I hope I never do. I don't know why I'm posting this here, but I feel like I need to get it off my chest. Maybe writing it down will help me make sense of it. Or maybe someone else has gone through something similar. Anyway, here goes. I live alone in a quiet neighborhood. It's the kind of place where you know your neighbors, but you're not exactly close to them. We nod, maybe chat about the weather, but that's it. A few months ago, there was a string of break-ins around here. Nothing violent, just petty theft. People's cars being broken into, the occasional garage being raided. It freaked me out enough to install a security camera. It was one of those basic systems, just a single camera aimed at the front yard. I wasn't expecting anything crazy, just some peace of mind. For the first week, everything was normal. I'd come home from work, lock the doors, check the footage out of habit, and go about my night. But small things started bothering me. There was a weird feeling I got sometimes, like someone was watching me as I walked from my car to the door. Dogs would bark for no reason in the middle of the night, and I could hear faint noises outside. Nothing big, just a rustling sound, like something brushing against the bushes. I figured it was a stray cat or the wind, so I didn't think much of it. Then one night, after hearing the noise again, I decided to check the footage. I wasn't expecting to see anything, but there it was, a shadow at the edge of my yard. It was just a glimpse, barely visible, but something about it felt off. I squinted at the screen, trying to figure out what it was, but I couldn't. I told myself it was probably nothing, maybe a branch moving in the wind. I shrugged it off and went to bed, a little uneasy but not too worried. A week after that, I was bored. and decided to review the footage again just to pass the time. I hadn't looked closely in days. As I scrolled through, something made me pause. There was a person standing still right at the edge of my yard. They were wearing a plain white mask, just standing there, staring directly at the camera. My heart started racing. I rewound the footage, watching it over and over, trying to tell myself it wasn't what I thought it was. Maybe it was a prank, someone passing by. I locked the doors, texted my friend about it, but didn't want to overreact. The next morning, though, I checked the footage again. The figure had been there all night, standing in the exact same spot, staring at the camera, completely still. They didn't move. They didn't do anything. They just stood there. I freaked out. I started checking the footage every night, obsessively, and every night, the same thing. The same masked figure standing in my yard, never moving, always staring. They never tried to get closer, never attempted to break in. But the fact that they were there was enough. I couldn't sleep. My anxiety shot through the roof. I started noticing other things. Footprints near the front steps, faint smudges on the window like someone had pressed their fingers against the glass. I called the police. They came out, looked around, and said it was probably just some kid playing a prank. "They're not doing anything illegal," they said. "Just stay vigilant." That didn't help. Every night, the figure appeared after I turned off the lights, like they knew I was inside, waiting for me to go to bed. I started double-checking the locks, closing the curtains, not leaving the house after dark. But no matter what I did, they kept coming. Then, I made a chilling discovery. When I went back through the footage, I realized the figure had been coming every night for the past week, longer than I'd noticed. They'd always been there, in the exact same spot, watching. I'd just been too distracted to catch it earlier. In a panic, I called the police again, demanding they take me seriously. This time, they came out and did a more thorough search. Still, they found nothing. No signs of anyone lurking around, no evidence other than the footage I had. They told me to keep an eye on things and call them if anything escalated, but I knew it was already escalating. That night, I decided I'd stay up and watch the footage live. At around 2 a.m., the figure appeared. My heart pounded as I watched, waiting for something to change. For the first time, it did. The figure started moving, slowly, walking up the driveway toward my front door. I felt frozen in place, unable to look away. When they were just a few steps away from the door, the camera feed went black. I stared at the screen, my breath caught in my throat. After what felt like an eternity, the feed came back. The figure was gone. No sign of them. Nothing. I ran to the door, my hands shaking, but there was no one outside. That's when I realized they knew about the camera. They were toying with me. Since then, the figure hasn't reappeared, but I can't shake the feeling that they're still watching. I haven't slept properly in weeks. I keep finding little things, footprints in the dirt, a window latch slightly ajar, a lock that feels looser than it should. The police don't believe me, and honestly, I don't know what to believe anymore. This morning, I found something in my mailbox. A piece of paper with 3 words scribbled on it. "See you soon." I haven't seen the figure in weeks, but I know they're still out there, watching, waiting. Locked in the basement, I didn't really know the host. A friend of mine had invited me to this house party in a quiet, suburban neighborhood. One of those houses that feel weirdly isolated, even though it's surrounded by others. I wasn't super excited about going, but it was a Friday night and I didn't want to be the guy who stayed in while everyone else went out. The house itself was kind of strange. The layout didn't make sense. Long, narrow hallways that twisted around in odd directions, rooms that felt too dark no matter how many lights were on. It had this creepy basement that the host was overly eager for everyone to check out. He kept mentioning it to the group, telling us we had to see it. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now, looking back, it seems like a red flag. When I saw the basement door, I noticed something odd. It was way heavier than a normal door, like it didn't belong in the house. The latch was strange too, reinforced, like it was meant to lock something in or someone out. At some point during the night, a few of the guys dared me to go down there. It was supposed to be a joke, like, go down, take a look, and tell us if you see any ghosts. I laughed it off at first, but after some egging on, I agreed. I didn't want to seem like a wuss, you know? I walked down the creaky stairs and immediately felt uncomfortable. The basement was colder than I expected, the kind of cold that makes your skin prickle. The air was stale, carrying a damp, musty smell that reminded me of old, forgotten places. I figured I'd walk around for a minute, then go back upstairs and tell them there was nothing to see. As I was wandering through, the door slammed shut behind me, hard. I jumped, but I figured one of the guys had pulled a prank on me. I laughed, half annoyed, and yelled up the stairs for them to open the door. No answer. The music upstairs was still thumping, so I assumed they just hadn't heard me. But as I waited, the sounds from above started to fade. The laughter, the music, all of it slowly disappeared. I pounded on the door again, still nothing. That's when I realized something was wrong. My phone had no signal, and the basement door wasn't budging. I started to feel uneasy. This was no longer funny. I tried to stay calm and started looking for another way out. The basement was bigger than it looked from the top of the stairs. There were old, dusty boxes stacked in the corners, broken pieces of furniture scattered around, and what looked like a rusty generator. My mind was racing. The longer I stayed down there, the more my unease turned into full-blown anxiety. After a while, I noticed something strange behind a pile of old shelves. There was a door. It didn't look like it was part of the original house. It was old, made of heavy metal, like something you'd see in a bunker. I don't know what made me open it, but I did. Inside was a narrow tunnel. It led to what looked like an old bomb shelter. The walls were concrete, cracked and stained, with random bits of decaying furniture and tools scattered around. I saw old gas masks hanging from hooks, rusted and useless. In the corner, there was a small table with a dusty journal on it. I opened the journal and skimmed through it. The handwriting was messy, almost frantic, and the entries made no sense. Whoever wrote it was paranoid, constantly referring to them, but never saying who or what they were. The last entry just stopped mid-sentence, like the person had been interrupted. The air down there was thick, suffocating, and the walls of the shelter were scratched. It felt like the whole place was closing in on me. I started hearing noises, faint at first, like footsteps, or maybe it was scraping. I wasn't sure if it was my imagination, but every sound made my heart race faster. The sounds grew louder. Footsteps, definitely footsteps. Someone, or something, was coming down the tunnel. I panicked and rushed back to the basement door, but no matter how hard I pushed, it wouldn't open. I was trapped. The footsteps were getting closer, echoing in the narrow tunnel. My only thought was to hide, so I ran back into the shelter and crouched in a corner, trying to make myself as small as possible. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. The footsteps stopped, but the silence was worse. I didn't know what to expect. Would someone come for me, or was I completely on my own? Minutes passed, then more footsteps. This time, they were on the stairs above me. I was stuck between two terrors, the tunnel behind me and whatever was coming from the basement stairs. In a panic, I made the worst decision. I followed the tunnel deeper, hoping it led outside. The air grew thicker, harder to breathe. My vision blurred, and I stumbled forward until I reached a rusted, sealed hatch. It wouldn't open. I was trapped. I could hear the noises again, from both the tunnel and the stairs. There was no escape. I must have passed out from fear or exhaustion, because when I woke up, it was morning. The basement door creaked open, and the host found me curled up in the corner. He laughed, saying it was all just a prank gone wrong. Everyone upstairs was hung over, acting like it was no big deal. But I was shaken. I tried telling them about the shelter and the journal, but when I showed them the basement, it looked normal. The door to the tunnel wasn't there anymore. They all thought I was just messed up from being scared, but I know what I saw. As I was leaving the house, I glanced back and noticed the basement window. It was open, just a crack, and I swear I saw a shadow move inside. I couldn't let it go. A few days later, I went back to the house, but it was completely empty. No one answered the door. The basement window was shut now, but the house felt wrong. I stood there for a while, feeling like I was being watched. I'm not sure what's still down there, but if you ever find yourself at a house party, don't go exploring the basement. Just don't. The Vanishing Campground. I've always been a skeptic when it comes to supernatural stories, but what happened to me on a camping trip a few years ago still haunts me. I don't know what we experienced that weekend, but it wasn't ghosts or anything paranormal. It was real, and that's what makes it worse. At the time, I was burned out from work and needed a break. My two closest friends, Jack and Lucy, felt the same, so we planned a spontaneous camping trip. We wanted to get away from everything. No phones, no distractions. Jack found this remote campground online, one that barely had any reviews or information. It was perfect, or so we thought. Looking back, it should have been a red flag that there wasn't much info about it, but we brushed it off. The drive took hours, and when we finally got there, the place was completely empty. No other campers, no sounds, just trees, endless trees. At first, we thought it was a blessing. A whole campground to ourselves? That's what we came for, right? But the longer I stood there, the more the silence got to me. It wasn't peaceful. It was oppressive. As we set up camp, I noticed something weird. In the bushes near our site, there was an old, rusted tent pole sticking out of the dirt. It looked ancient, like it had been there for years. I pointed it out, but Jack just laughed it off, saying it was probably from someone's old setup. I shrugged it off too, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that came with it. The next morning, we decided to hike a trail that was supposed to lead to a beautiful overlook. Being out in nature was refreshing. No phones buzzing, no traffic, just the sounds of the forest. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The forest was too quiet. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing there, watching us. It sounds stupid now, but at the time, I just figured it was my mind playing tricks on me. We hiked for hours, and by the time we got back to the campsite, the sun was starting to dip below the trees. As we approached, I stopped dead in my tracks. Our campsite was a mess. The tent was flattened, our sleeping bags were tossed into the woods, and our gear was scattered everywhere. At first, we thought it was an animal, but there were no tracks, no signs of anything. It was like someone had come through and deliberately destroyed everything. We argued about what to do. Jack thought it was just some prank or a bear, but Lucy wasn't so sure. I was on edge, but I didn't want to panic. While we were gathering our stuff, Lucy found something that chilled us all. One of our backpacks, zipped up and placed neatly in the middle of the trees, far from our camp. It wasn't thrown or dragged. It was placed. We all stood there in silence, staring at it. As the sun set, we debated leaving. Lucy was all for it, but Jack insisted we stay the night and figure things out in the morning. Hiking out in the dark wasn't exactly a safe option either. So, we rebuilt our camp as best as we could. But as night fell, the tension was suffocating. The fire barely lit up the surrounding trees, and I could feel the darkness pressing in on us. That's when we started hearing it. soft footsteps just beyond the edge of the light. Every time we shined a flashlight into the trees, nothing. Just more darkness. The sounds would stop, only to start again when we turned away. Jack was getting angry, convinced someone was messing with us. He yelled into the woods, demanding whoever it was to show themselves, but only silence followed. The night dragged on, and none of us could sleep. When morning came, Jack was gone. His tent was open, his things still inside, but there was no sign of him. We called out, searched the area, but nothing. Lucy was hysterical, begging to leave, but I thought we needed to find Jack first. We couldn't just leave him out there. So we searched, deeper and deeper into the forest, calling his name. It didn't take long for us to realize we were lost. The trees all looked the same, and every direction felt wrong. That's when Lucy found it, a piece of Jack's jacket, torn and caught on a branch, far from the trail. Panic set in. It felt like we were being led deeper into the forest, away from the campsite. The footsteps started again, this time louder, more deliberate. Something, or someone, was out there, watching us. I knew it wasn't an animal. This was different. This was intentional. We rushed back to the campsite, desperate to leave. But when we got there, everything was gone. Our tents, our bags, everything vanished without a trace. There wasn't even a footprint in the dirt. We didn't stop to think. We just ran. Through the trees, over the roots, tripping and stumbling in our desperation to get out. The sun was setting, and the forest seemed to close in on us. The sounds of snapping branches followed us, like whatever was out there wasn't done with us yet. My heart was pounding, and all I could think was that we weren't going to make it. Somehow, we found the main road. There was no sign of Jack, no sign of our campsite, nothing, just the two of us, standing on the edge of the forest, breathless and terrified. Lucy barely spoke the whole drive back. I couldn't stop looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone, or something, following us. Jack was never found. Search parties combed the area, but there was no trace of him. The authorities said it was probably an accidental disappearance, but I know better. Something happened in that forest, something real, and even now, I can't shake the feeling that I'm still being watched. Sometimes I get anonymous messages, just images of dense forests, sent from an unknown number. I don't know who's sending them, but I can't help but wonder if Jack's still out there somewhere, waiting. Last week, I had to take a detour on my drive home from work. I don't usually mind driving, but that day was different. The traffic was horrendous. I was crawling along for what felt like hours, and I just couldn't take it anymore. I'm a pretty cautious driver. I usually stick to main roads, avoid shortcuts, but I was frustrated. I remembered an old highway that cut through some backwoods. I hadn't used it in years, but I figured, why not? It might save me some time. As soon as I turned onto the old highway, I started regretting it. The road was in worse shape than I remembered. Potholes everywhere, and barely any signs. It was getting dark, too. The sun was sinking fast, and the sky turned this deep, heavy gray. No cars ahead, none behind. At first, I thought it was just nice to have the road to myself, but something about the quiet started to feel off. My radio kept flickering in and out, just static. I tried not to think too much about it. After all, it was just an old highway. But as I kept driving, I realized something else. There were no street lights. None. The road was narrower than I remembered, and weeds were creeping up onto the shoulder. It felt like the kind of place no one drove anymore. A little voice in the back of my head told me I should turn back, but there was no easy way to do that without making a U-turn, and that seemed like too much trouble. So I kept going. By the time full darkness fell, I was really starting to regret my decision. The road was completely empty, and my headlights were the only thing cutting through the night. I couldn't see anything past the edges of the beams, just trees and shadow. Then, in my rearview mirror, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Headlights. Another car. I didn't know why it bothered me so much at first. I was relieved, actually. After miles of feeling like I was the last person on Earth, it was good to know someone else was out here. But after a few minutes, that relief disappeared. The car didn't pass me, it just stayed behind, hanging back at a steady distance. I kept checking the mirror, trying not to let it get to me. It's nothing, I told myself. Just someone else taking a shortcut, same as you. But why weren't they passing? The road was wide enough here. I sped up a little, hoping they'd go around. They didn't. They matched my speed exactly. A shiver ran down my spine, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. My palms started sweating, and the steering wheel felt slick in my grip. I glanced down at my phone. No service. Perfect. I was alone on a deserted highway, with no way to call for help, and some random car was following me. I told myself it was probably nothing. Maybe they were just cautious too. But then, their headlights flicked off. For a second, I was plunged into total darkness. My heart jumped into my throat. The lights came back on after a few seconds, but that moment, it felt like a warning. I didn't know what to do. The road was so narrow now, with no shoulder to pull off onto. I wasn't about to stop and find out who was behind me either. I tried speeding up again. So did they. Every time I accelerated, they matched me. I was stuck, with nowhere to go, and panic started creeping in. For a split second, I thought about pulling over, confronting them. But then, my mind spun with possibilities. What if they weren't just some frustrated driver? What if it was something more dangerous? Suddenly, the car behind me swerved hard to the side, almost clipping my bumper. My heart raced as I swerved to avoid them. I thought for sure they were about to crash into me, but they corrected themselves, falling back into line behind me. I couldn't breathe properly at this point. I just wanted out. And then, I saw it. A sign for an exit. Relief flooded through me. I took the turn sharply, nearly missing the ramp. For a moment, the other car wasn't behind me anymore. I felt my muscles start to relax, but then, headlights in the rear view again. They'd followed me. I didn't even have time to process it before the car sped up, barreling toward me at full speed. They were tailgating me now, so close that I thought they were going to hit me. I swerved, my whole body tense with fear, and still, they kept coming. My only thought was to find some way to escape, but there was nothing, just more empty road. My heart was slamming in my chest, and every muscle in my body screamed with tension. Then, just when I thought they were about to ram me, they veered off at the last second. I heard the tires screech, and in the mirror, I saw their car careen off the road, crashing into the ditch. For a moment, I couldn't move. Should I stop? Should I check on them? But fear took over, and I just kept going, my foot heavy on the gas. As I sped away, I glanced in the mirror one last time. The car was totaled, but the driver was standing beside it, watching me leave. I drove faster. Eventually, I spotted a small gas station up ahead, its neon sign flickering in the distance. I pulled in, my hands shaking on the wheel, and sat there, trying to catch my breath. I couldn't stop thinking about that driver. Who were they? Was it road rage? Or something worse? I checked my phone, finally seeing that I had service again. A notification popped up. Heavy traffic on main highway due to accident. Avoid side roads. I haven't taken that old highway since, and honestly, I don't know if I ever will. Something about it still sticks with me. The way that driver just stood there, watching me drive away. I can't help but wonder if I was lucky to get out. The disappearing package. Okay, I never thought I'd post here, but after everything that's happened, I need to tell someone. It started out so small, and now I don't know how to make it stop. A few months ago, I noticed packages disappearing from my porch. At first, I didn't think much of it. I live alone in a quiet neighborhood, work from home most days, and I order a lot of stuff online. It wasn't anything too important, just a book, some household items. I figured it was either a delivery mistake or maybe someone taking advantage of the fact I wasn't always paying attention. Annoying, sure, but not worth stressing over. But then it kept happening. What bothered me more were these weird little things I started noticing around the same time. I'd hear footsteps late at night, but when I checked, there was no one there. My neighbors seemed different too, quieter, like they were avoiding me. I didn't think it was connected, but it made everything feel off. Then one night, I woke up to what sounded like someone dragging their feet on my porch. I got up, checked the front door, and nothing. No one was there. That's when I started to get really uncomfortable. The third time a package disappeared, I decided to take action. I bought a cheap security camera online and installed it by my front door. It made me feel a little better, like I was taking control of the situation. I figured if I could catch the person on camera, I could at least figure out who was doing it. A few days later, I finally got something. I was scrolling through the footage, and there it was. Around 2 a.m., someone approached my door. They bent down, grabbed the package, and walked off. But when I looked closer, something wasn't right. Their face, it wasn't just hard to see, it was blurred, like they didn't want to be recognized. It wasn't a glitch. It was too precise, too deliberate. That's when my fear started to replace the frustration. Who was this person? Why were they doing this? I showed the footage to a few friends. They all said the same thing. It was creepy. One of them suggested I call the police, but I wasn't sure. It still felt like a small issue to bother them with. Then, things got worse. A few days later, I found a package on my doorstep, but it wasn't anything I ordered. It was small, wrapped up like a gift, but inside was just junk. A random toy, maybe from a child's dollhouse. No return address, no note. That's when I knew this wasn't just someone stealing packages. I finally contacted the police. They sent an officer to take a report, but he didn't seem to take it seriously. He said it was probably just a prank or a neighbor messing around. He promised they'd send more patrols through the area, but I could tell he wasn't really concerned. That didn't help. My anxiety skyrocketed. I was scared to leave the house, and even when I did, I felt like I was being watched. I checked the camera footage constantly, waiting for the person to come back. I stopped ordering things online, and when I had to, I made sure I was home to get the package immediately. Then I found the note. It was left in my mailbox, not delivered by any service. Just a handwritten message on a plain piece of paper. Thank you for the gifts. No name, no explanation. My heart raced. Someone had been watching me. And worse, they thought I was willingly giving them something. I changed the locks, added more cameras, but nothing made me feel safer. Every night I jumped at every little sound. I barely slept. I went to the police again, but they still didn't have any answers. They didn't even have a lead. Then the camera caught them again. This time, they weren't taking anything. The figure just stood there, in the middle of my porch, looking directly at the camera. Their face was still blurred, but the way they stood, so calm, so confident, made my skin crawl. It felt like they were mocking me, like they knew I was watching, and they didn't care. I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to do something. After thinking it over for days, I decided to set a trap. I ordered a package and waited. I stayed up that night, glued to the live feed from the camera. Every noise outside made my heart race. Hours passed, but nothing happened. Just as I was about to give up and go to bed, there was a soft knock at the door. I froze. Slowly, I checked the camera feed. The figure was there again, bending down as if to grab the package. But this time, they didn't take it. Instead, they slid something under my door, a small envelope. I waited until they left, then I grabbed the envelope. Inside was a single piece of paper with my new address written on it. I hadn't told anyone I was planning to move. My stomach dropped. They knew. No matter what I did, they were always one step ahead. I called the police in a panic, but when they arrived, there was nothing. No fingerprints, no sign of the person. It was like they had never been there. I moved after that. I thought maybe getting away would help, but even in my new apartment, the feeling didn't go away. I still felt watched. Sometimes I noticed things out of place, or I'd get the sense someone was following me when I went out. Then, a few days ago, I found another note in my mailbox. It was just 3 words. You can't hide forever. I don't know what to do now. The notes have stopped for the moment, but I know it's not over. I've thought about moving again, but I have this sinking feeling that no matter where I go, they'll always know. So yeah, that's my story. Just be careful. Pay attention to the little things, because sometimes, no matter what you do, someone's watching. The Subway Stalker. I've never been one to post on Reddit, but after what happened, I need to get this off my chest. Maybe it'll help someone else avoid what I went through. This isn't some crazy ghost story, and nothing supernatural happened. This is something that could happen to anyone, and that's what scares me the most. I live in a big city, the kind where everyone is always in a rush, and the subway is the fastest way to get around. I take the same train every morning to work, and it's always packed with people. Most days, I put my earbuds in, stare at my phone, and zone out until I reach my stop. But recently, something felt off. I noticed this guy. He wasn't doing anything weird, really. He was just there, sitting a few seats away, but I kept seeing him every morning. He wasn't remarkable, average height, dark jacket, plain face. But no matter where I sat or how crowded the train was, he was always somewhere nearby. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence. Lots of people have the same commute, right? But then I started to feel like maybe he was watching me. I shook it off. It had to be in my head. One morning, things shifted. I got off at my usual stop, and so did he. Again, nothing weird. It's a busy stop. But as I walked the few blocks to my office, I noticed he was still behind me. Not close enough to be obvious, but close enough that I couldn't ignore it. I told myself it was nothing. He probably worked nearby. But over the next few days, the same thing happened. He'd get off the train with me, follow the same route, and always hang back just enough to seem like he wasn't following me. Except he definitely was. I started changing my routine. I'd switch subway cars at the last minute or take a different exit from the station, but no matter what I did, he was always there. It became impossible to ignore. My heart would race every time I saw him step off the train after me. I'd walk faster, take different turns, anything to lose him, but it never worked. He was always there, lingering. One night after a late shift, I looked back as I was walking home, and there he was, standing across the street, staring right at me. No phone, no distractions, just watching. That's when the fear really hit me. This wasn't just my imagination, he was following me. I tried talking to a friend about it. I expected her to tell me I was overreacting, and she did. "It's probably just someone with the same schedule," she said. "You live in a big city, it happens." I wanted to believe her, but I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that followed me everywhere now. A few days later, I spotted him standing outside my office building, just waiting. He wasn't trying to blend in anymore. He wanted me to see him. I decided enough was enough. The next time I saw him on the train, I worked up the nerve to confront him. As I stepped off at my stop, he followed, as usual. I stopped in the middle of the sidewalk, turned around, and looked him dead in the eyes. "Why are you following me?" I asked, my voice shaking. He didn't even flinch. He just smiled, this cold, unnerving smile, and walked away without saying a word. It felt like he was taunting me, like he knew I couldn't do anything. My skin crawled. After that, I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat. I kept replaying that moment in my head, wondering what he was planning, what he wanted. I decided to take time off work and stay with a friend for a few days. I needed to clear my head, but the fear never left. One night, while scrolling through the news, my heart nearly stopped. There was his face, the man from the subway. The article said he was wanted in connection with several disappearances, all women around my age, and the latest one matched my description almost exactly. I felt sick. I was so close. If I hadn't confronted him, would I have been next? I started to panic, my thoughts racing. He was still out there. I wasn't safe. Even though I wasn't on the subway anymore, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still watching me, waiting for another chance. A few nights later, I got a text from an unknown number. "You got away this time." I dropped my phone, my whole body trembling. I took the message to the police along with the article, but they couldn't do much. There wasn't enough evidence to tie him to me specifically, and he was still out there. Now, every time I walk down the street, I feel eyes on me. Every time I take a different route or look over my shoulder, I expect to see him. The fear hasn't gone away, it's only grown. I try to move on with my life, but it's impossible. I've changed my locks, stopped taking the subway, even moved to a new apartment, but it doesn't matter. He's still in my head, and every time I see a man in a dark jacket, I freeze, wondering if it's him. I guess the worst part is knowing that while I managed to escape, there are other women who didn't. The guilt eats at me. Maybe if I'd gone to the police sooner, maybe if I hadn't been so scared, I could have helped them. So, I'm writing this now, hoping that maybe someone else will read it and trust their gut. If you ever feel like someone's watching you, don't ignore it. The real monsters aren't the ones hiding under your bed. They're the ones you pass on the street every day. I don't know if anyone will believe me, but I need to get this out. Maybe someone's had a similar experience. This happened a few months ago, and it still makes my skin crawl when I think about it. I was on a solo road trip, something I've done a lot. I've always enjoyed the freedom of driving for hours, music on, nothing but the open road ahead. It was one of those long stretches of highway, completely empty, no other cars, just fields on either side. The kind of isolation that's relaxing until it's not. I'd been driving for hours and was starting to feel a little lost. My GPS had been acting up and I missed a turn somewhere, so I decided to pull over and check my map. That's when I saw it, an old abandoned gas station on the side of the road. It was falling apart, overgrown with weeds, the kind of place that looked like it hadn't been used in decades. For some reason, though, it made sense to stop there. I pulled into the cracked, faded parking lot. There was something about the station that felt off. It was too quiet, too still. As I sat there, looking at the map, I felt like something was watching me. I tried to shake the feeling, but then I saw it. A flicker of light from inside the station, just for a second, but it was enough to freeze me in place. I stared at the station for a moment, debating whether to check it out. My gut told me to leave, but my curiosity got the better of me. Maybe it was just an old electrical thing or a reflection, I thought. Against my better judgment, I got out of the car and started walking toward the building. Up close, it looked even worse. Windows boarded up, the pumps rusted and covered in graffiti. But as I approached, that feeling of being watched grew stronger. I tried to laugh it off, telling myself it was just nerves. Then the light flickered again. This time, I was sure it came from inside. When I got to the front, I noticed something that made my heart pound. Footprints in the dust. Fresh ones. My first thought was that someone else had been here recently, but the station had been closed for years. Panic started to creep in. I backed away, suddenly very aware of how alone I was out there. I was about to head back to the car when I heard it. A low scrape, like metal dragging across concrete. The sound came from inside the station. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment I couldn't move. My mind was racing, trying to rationalize what I'd heard. Maybe it was an animal or something falling over, but deep down, I knew better. I turned and walked quickly, almost running back to my car. As I reached the door and glanced back at the building, something moved. A shadow, shifting behind one of the old gas pumps. Someone was out there, watching me. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys, heart pounding in my chest. I jumped in, locked the doors, and started the engine. I just wanted to get out of there. As I pulled out of the lot, I glanced back one last time and saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the building, watching me leave. I floored it. My whole body was shaking, and I couldn't stop glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting to see something behind me. A few miles down the road, my nerves started to settle, but then I saw them. Headlights in the distance, getting closer. At first, I tried to tell myself it was just another car, but there hadn't been a single car on this road for hours, and the headlights were speeding up. My chest tightened. Whoever it was, they were following me. I pressed the gas pedal harder, but the headlights stayed right behind me, matching my speed. I tried to check my map again, searching for the nearest town or highway exit, but the road ahead stretched on forever. Just empty, dark highway. The car behind me swerved slightly, like the driver was toying with me. My heart raced, and I was sweating, hands gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. And just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the headlights suddenly veered off, disappearing down a side road. But I couldn't relax. The danger didn't feel over. I kept driving until I saw a small town in the distance. Relief washed over me as I pulled into a brightly lit gas station. I parked near the entrance, the lights making me feel a little safer. I sat there, catching my breath, trying to calm down. But when I glanced at the glass doors, my stomach dropped. There was a figure standing in the shadows across the street, just standing there, watching me. My heart started racing again. Was it the same person from the gas station? Was it all in my head? I wanted to go inside the station, but I felt paralyzed, trapped by my own fear. I kept staring at the figure, trying to make out any details, but they stayed motionless. And then, without warning, they turned and walked into the night, disappearing from sight. I didn't feel safe anymore, not even in the town. I thought about driving through the night without stopping, determined never to pull over at a place like that again. As I pulled out of the station, I checked the rearview mirror out of habit, and my blood ran cold. A set of headlights turned on behind me. I haven't taken another solo road trip since. I avoid remote places like the plague. I don't know what I saw that night, and I don't want to know. But every time I'm alone on the road, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. And I'm always checking the mirror, looking for those headlights. It started about a month ago. I live a pretty quiet life, just me in a small apartment, working from home as a software developer. My routine is pretty normal. Coffee in the morning, gym in the afternoon, maybe grab a beer with a friend in the evening. I'm not someone who's into conspiracy theories or prone to paranoia. At least, I wasn't. The first time it happened, I didn't think much of it. I was getting ready for bed when my phone buzzed. It was an unknown number with a message that just said, "Watch out." I thought it was probably spam or a wrong number, so I ignored it and went to sleep. But something about it felt off. I couldn't shake this weird feeling. but I convinced myself I was overthinking it. A few days later, I was at my favorite coffee shop working on my laptop when I got another message. This one was different. "I saw you at the coffee shop. Watch out." My heart skipped a beat. I'd been at the coffee shop for about an hour, and there was nothing special about my day. I looked around, but nothing seemed out of place. I texted a couple of friends, asking if they were messing with me. All of them denied it. That night, I started to feel uneasy. I went through my head, trying to figure out who could have seen me and why they would text me like this. It wasn't a joke anymore. It felt like someone was watching me. A few days later, after a gym session, I received another text. "You look tired today." My stomach dropped. I had just left the gym. The timing was too perfect. It had to be someone close by. That's when the paranoia really started to set in. I kept checking my surroundings, trying to spot someone suspicious. I didn't see anyone paying particular attention to me, but it didn't matter. The messages kept coming, and each one was more specific than the last. "Nice walk in the park." "You forgot your keys again." The more I tried to ignore them, the more anxious I became. I started changing my routine, taking different routes to the gym, working from different coffee shops, but the messages didn't stop. It felt like whoever this was, they knew everything, my every move. No matter what I did, they were always one step ahead. I bought a new phone, changed my number, and even deleted all my social media accounts. For a few days, things were quiet, and I thought maybe I had finally cut off whoever was doing this. But then, my new phone buzzed. "Nice try. Watch out." I couldn't sleep. I was constantly checking my phone, waiting for the next message. It didn't matter where I went or who I was with. I felt exposed, like someone was watching me all the time. I stopped hanging out with friends, stopped going out unless I absolutely had to. I barely left the house, working from my kitchen table and obsessively checking my phone for the next "watch out." After weeks of this, I received a message that made my blood run cold. "You should talk to my friend's name. He's been with you a lot lately." I froze. One of my closest friends had been spending time with me during the days mentioned in the messages. Could it really be him? Was this whole thing just some kind of sick prank? I didn't want to believe it, but I couldn't think of any other explanation. He was one of the few people who knew my routine well enough to pull this off. I confronted him. I felt stupid even bringing it up, but I was desperate for answers. At first, he denied everything, but eventually, he laughed. That's when I realized. He had been using an anonymous messaging app to send those texts, tracking me and picking up details from our conversations to make the messages more believable. He thought it was funny, a way to freak me out for a little while. I didn't laugh. I yelled at him, telling him how messed up it was to make me feel like I was being stalked. He apologized, but he didn't seem to understand how deeply it had affected me. Even after he confessed, I couldn't calm down. I thought hearing the truth would bring relief, but instead, it made me feel worse. The damage had already been done. As I left his apartment, my phone buzzed again. "Watch out, I'm still here." My heart pounded. I stared at the screen, wondering if it was part of the same joke. Maybe he was just continuing the prank to mess with me. Or maybe there was someone else. My friend swore he was done with it, that he wouldn't send another message. But then, why did I feel like I wasn't alone? I tried to go back to normal, but every time my phone buzzed, I felt my pulse quicken. I couldn't stop checking it. It didn't matter if it was just a notification or a regular message. I expected another "watch out" every time. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone might still be watching me, even though I knew it was supposed to be over. One night, I was lying in bed, trying to sleep, when my phone lit up. The screen showed an unknown number. My heart pounded in my chest as I opened the message. "Watch out!" I stared at it, frozen. Was this still part of the joke? Or was there someone else out there? I haven't confronted my friend about it, but I can't help but wonder. Every time my phone buzzes, I brace myself. I thought I was over it, but the truth is, I don't know if the joke ever really ended. The Vanishing Hiker. I've always loved hiking. It's my way of disconnecting, clearing my head. I've done plenty of solo hikes before, so when I planned a trip to a less crowded national park, it didn't feel like a big deal. I wanted to avoid people, and that park seemed perfect, remote, quiet, and with miles of unmarked trails to explore. When I arrived, though, something felt off. The parking lot was almost empty, and the air felt unnaturally still. I couldn't quite place it, but the silence seemed too heavy, like the forest was holding its breath. Still, I brushed it off. The quiet was what I'd come for, right? I grabbed my backpack and headed out. A couple of miles in, I saw something weird. A shoe lying on the edge of the trail. Just one, half buried in the dirt, the laces frayed. I hesitated, but kept walking, telling myself it was probably left behind by some careless hiker. It wasn't a good sign, but I wasn't about to let something small ruin my day. As the hours passed, the trail became less defined. It was harder to follow, and soon the markers disappeared entirely. I wasn't worried at first. I had a GPS and a map, and I'd always been good with directions. But something was starting to gnaw at me. The woods felt denser here, darker. I hadn't seen another person since I started, and a sense of being watched was creeping over me. That's when my GPS stopped working. No signal, no map. My phone, which had been fully charged, suddenly drained to 10%. I stood there, staring at the screen in disbelief. How was this possible? I was miles from the nearest trailhead, in the middle of nowhere, and now I had no way to track where I was. I tried not to panic, but the feeling of being watched was stronger now. Every few minutes I'd hear a soft rustle behind me, like footsteps in the leaves. When I turned around, there was nothing. I started walking faster, hoping to find my way back to the trail, but I was completely disoriented. At one point, I thought I saw a figure in the distance, just a glimpse of movement through the trees. I called out, "Hello?" But no one answered. When I got closer, the figure was gone. I felt my stomach drop. I wasn't alone out here. Eventually, I stumbled into a small clearing. There was an old, faded sign, its letters barely legible. It was a warning, but I couldn't make out what it said. That's when I realized I'd wandered into an unmarked area not shown on any map I had. I was lost. Hours later, exhausted and increasingly anxious, I found something that made my blood run cold. A campsite. But not just any campsite. This one looked abandoned in a hurry. The tent was ripped, supplies scattered everywhere. A backpack was lying open, its contents spilled out as if someone had frantically searched through it. I looked around, hoping to find someone or some clue as to what had happened, but it was eerily empty. There were half-eaten food packets, a mug still half full of cold coffee. Another shoe, just one, lying in the dirt, like the one I'd seen earlier. As I stood there, I heard it again, rustling in the trees, closer this time. My heart pounded in my chest, but when I scanned the tree line, there was no one. Every nerve in my body was screaming that something was very, very wrong. I needed to leave, but no matter which direction I tried, I kept coming back to the same damn clearing. It was like I was walking in circles. Desperation kicked in. I went back to the torn tent, searching for anything that might help. Inside, I found a small notebook. The last few pages were scrawled in a frenzy, the same phrase over and over again. "It's not alone. Don't stay." That was it. I had to get out of there. I decided to head toward the distant mountain range I'd seen earlier. It wasn't on the map, but at least it was a fixed point. I couldn't rely on trails anymore. As I moved deeper into the woods, the feeling of being followed intensified. The footsteps behind me were unmistakable now. Someone was out there, trailing me. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal, but the steps were too steady, too human. I picked up the pace, but so did they. Fear flooded my veins. I needed to hide. My eyes darted around for cover, and I spotted a fallen log. I dropped behind it, barely breathing, waiting. The footsteps got closer. Through the gaps in the log, I saw him. A man, dirty, disheveled, and muttering to himself, scanning the woods like he was searching for something. His clothes were torn, and his eyes darted around, wild and unfocused. He stopped right in front of my hiding spot, sniffing the air like an animal. I held my breath, praying he wouldn't find me. Seconds dragged on like hours. Just when I thought he'd leave, I stepped on a branch. The snap was deafening. His head whipped around, and his eyes locked on mine. I ran. Branches whipped at my face. My legs burned, but I didn't stop. I could hear him behind me, crashing through the undergrowth, gaining on me. There was no more pretending. I was being hunted. I don't know how long I ran, but when I finally looked back, he was gone. Silence, except for my ragged breathing. I stumbled onto another trail marker, one I recognized. Hope surged in my chest, and I pushed toward the park entrance. I thought I was safe. But as I neared the trailhead, I heard it again, rustling, too close for comfort. I didn't look back. I couldn't. When I finally reached my car, I was shaking. Other hikers were just starting their day, oblivious to the nightmare I'd just escaped. I got in my car and drove away, hands trembling on the wheel. I didn't warn them. I couldn't. I haven't been back to the woods since. But sometimes, when I'm alone, I swear I see him, standing at the edge of the trees, watching, waiting. The sounds from the basement. I never thought I'd be the type to write one of these posts, but what happened to me recently is still messing with my head. I've been in this house for about 6 months now. After my divorce, I decided to move into an older place in a quieter neighborhood. It felt like the fresh start I needed. The house isn't anything special, just a small 2-story building with a basement. The first few months were fine. I liked the quiet, the space. Being alone was actually peaceful. At first, I barely noticed the basement. It's unfinished, mostly storage space, and I never had any reason to go down there. But about 2 weeks ago, I started hearing noises. Faint at first, creaks, clicks. I figured it was just the house settling or maybe the heating system kicking in. The sounds were easy enough to ignore. It's an old house, right? Old houses make noises. But then, one night, I smelled something odd near the basement door. It was faint, like damp earth or something stale. I brushed it off, but the smell stuck with me. It made me uneasy. A few nights later, I was lying in bed when I heard it again, the noise. Only this time, it wasn't faint. It sounded like something was moving down there. I tried to convince myself it was just the pipes, or maybe a draft. But the next night, it was louder. Something, or someone, was moving around in the basement. I was sure of it. I thought about calling someone, maybe having the place checked out, but it felt silly. I've been through a lot this year, and I figured it was just my anxiety playing tricks on me. It wasn't like I was hearing voices or anything. It was just noises. I told myself it was the heating system, even though the sound was way too distinct. It felt too real. Then, one night, the noise stopped suddenly. Just as I was lying there, thinking it was done, I heard a distinct creak, like someone stepping on the last stair. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. I waited, holding my breath, but nothing followed. That moment, though, it felt way too real. After that, I tried to ignore the basement altogether. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I started avoiding that part of the house, leaving lights on at night to keep the shadows at bay. A few nights later, as I walked past the basement door, I noticed something strange. There was a draft. Cold air was coming from the gap at the bottom of the door. That's not normal, right? I stood there for a while trying to figure out what to do. I thought about opening the door and going down there, but I didn't. I couldn't. Not yet. I went back to bed, but the noises didn't stop. If anything, they got worse. That night, I heard something heavy dragging across the floor down there. It sounded too deliberate to be the heating system. The next evening, I decided to take a closer look. I was nervous, but I told myself I had to do it. Armed with a flashlight, I slowly opened the basement door. The air felt colder than usual, heavier. I stood at the top of the stairs, shining the light down, but everything looked normal. I took a deep breath and went down. The basement was just as I remembered, empty and dusty, with old boxes and a few pieces of furniture I hadn't unpacked yet. But then, I saw it. There, behind a few stacked boxes, was a small door I'd never noticed before. It was barely visible, hidden in the wall. My stomach turned. How had I missed this? I wasn't sure if the door had always been there, or if I just hadn't noticed it because of the boxes. It didn't matter. The door was there now, and I had to see what was behind it. I hesitated for what felt like an eternity, but finally, I grabbed the handle and pulled. The door creaked open, revealing nothing more than a crawl space. It was empty, unused, and covered in dust. I stood there, my heart pounding, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it really was just the house settling. Maybe the noises had just been in my head, a mix of stress and paranoia. As I stood there, relieved but confused, I heard it again, the creaking noise, faint but distinct. This time, it came from inside the crawl space. My skin crawled. I slammed the door shut and bolted upstairs, my heart racing. I tried to tell myself that it was just the house, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I spent the rest of the night trying to calm down, watching TV, scrolling through my phone, but every little noise set me on edge. Even though I'd opened the door and seen that nothing was down there, the basement felt wrong. It was like the house had secrets it wasn't telling me. I tried to sleep, but it was useless. Every creak, every small noise from the house sent my heart racing again. I kept telling myself it was just the wind or the pipes, but I couldn't fully convince myself. The draft from the basement door still lingered, and every time I thought about it, I felt a chill run down my spine. That night, just as I was starting to doze off, I heard it again. A faint creak, almost imperceptible, but enough to make me sit up in bed, heart pounding all over again. I'm going to call someone to check the basement. Maybe it's just my nerves, maybe it's nothing at all. But every time I think about that hidden door, I get this deep, unsettling feeling. I don't know if I'm alone in this house anymore. The unmarked van. I've always been a night owl. Studying late at the library and walking home alone wasn't something I thought twice about. My apartment is only a 15-minute walk from campus, in a pretty quiet area. The streets are empty that late, but I never really felt unsafe. Until that night. It was around 11:30 p.m., later than usual, but nothing too strange. The streets were quieter than normal, though. No wind, no passing cars. I noticed a few of the streetlights ahead flickering, but I figured it was just bad timing. As I turned onto my street, I saw an old, unmarked van parked a little further down the road. Nothing fancy, just a plain white van, the kind you see everywhere. Still, something about it felt off. I kept walking, trying not to think about it, but as I passed the van, I heard the low hum of the engine starting behind me. At first, I shrugged it off. Maybe the driver had been waiting for someone or something. Still, I couldn't shake the weird feeling creeping up my spine. I glanced over my shoulder, and sure enough, the van was trailing me, keeping a slow but deliberate distance. My heart rate picked up a little, but I tried to stay calm. This was a public street after all. People drive at night. I told myself it was just a coincidence. I crossed to the other side of the street, hoping the van would keep going. But it didn't. It mirrored my movements, crossing right after me. That's when the fear started to settle in. I sped up, hoping to get out of its line of sight. Just a few more blocks and I'd be home. But at the next intersection, the van suddenly sped up and swerved ahead, blocking my path. The driver didn't get out, but I could feel his eyes on me. I stood frozen for a second, my brain trying to process what was happening. Then I turned around and started walking back the way I came, forcing myself to stay calm. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe they just needed directions or something. But as I turned the corner, the van circled around and appeared again, this time on the parallel street. My heart was pounding in my chest. I pulled out my phone and texted my friend, asking them to stay on the line just in case, but no response. I was on my own. I kept walking, my pace quickening as I scanned the street for somewhere to go, but everything was closed. No open shops, no other pedestrians, no one. The van was creeping closer, and I could feel the panic rising in my throat. Should I call the police? What would I even say? A van is following me didn't sound like an emergency, but my gut told me this was serious. I tried cutting through a side street, hoping to lose them, but they followed. The van pulled up close to the curb, and I saw the window roll down slightly. My stomach dropped. That's when the van stopped completely, and two men got out. They were walking towards me with purpose, their footsteps echoing on the empty street. I could barely think straight. Should I run? Scream? There was no one around, and they were close enough that running felt useless. But then, out of nowhere, a car turned the corner, its headlights sweeping over us. The men stopped dead in their tracks. For a moment, none of us moved. The driver of the car slowed down, probably sensing something was off. After a tense second, the men turned around, got back into the van, and sped off down the street. I stood there, shaking, barely able to breathe. I couldn't believe what had just happened. The car drove on, unaware of how close I had been to whatever those men had planned. I didn't waste any time. As soon as the van disappeared, I bolted in the opposite direction, running the rest of the way home. When I finally got to my apartment, I slammed the door behind me and locked every bolt. My hands were trembling as I sat on the floor trying to catch my breath. My phone buzzed with messages from my friend, finally replying. I typed out what had just happened, my fingers shaking as I tried to explain the terror of it all. Later that night, I couldn't stop thinking about that van. What if the car hadn't shown up? I started Googling similar incidents, and to my horror, I found multiple reports of kidnappings involving unmarked vans in my area. It was too much to be a coincidence. I had barely escaped. I didn't sleep that night. Every little sound from the street made me jump. I kept looking out the window, expecting to see that van again, waiting, watching. It never came back, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't done. They'd try again, maybe with someone else. Even now, months later, I can't walk anywhere at night without feeling that same fear. Every van I see makes my heart race. Every time I hear an engine rev behind me, I freeze, convinced they've come back to finish what they started. I don't know if I'll ever feel safe again. I got lucky that night, but I keep thinking about the people who didn't. The stranger at the coffee shop. I've worked at this small coffee shop for the past year. It's just a part-time job while I finish school, but I've always liked the atmosphere, quiet, familiar, safe. At least, it used to feel that way. I'm a 26-year-old college student, juggling classes and work like most people my age. I usually take the closing shifts, which means I'm often the last person to leave the shop. The place empties out by 8 p.m., and I clean up alone. For the most part, it's been fine. Nothing ever really happens here. That is, until a few weeks ago. It started with a man who came into the shop. I didn't think much of it at first. We get regulars all the time. But this guy was different. He never ordered anything. He'd just sit in the corner, watching. At first, I tried to brush it off. Maybe he was just waiting for someone or killing time. But he kept coming back, and every time, he just sat there, staring at me. It wasn't the typical kind of stare either. It was unblinking, too focused. The way he watched me made my skin crawl, but I told myself it was nothing, just a weird guy. Every place has one, right? Then, one night after closing, I went to my car and found a note tucked under the windshield wiper. It was a simple piece of paper, but the message shook me. You're always alone at this time. Be careful. It was signed DM, the same initials on the loyalty card the man used to scan when he came in. My heart sank. How did he know I was alone? And why did he leave a note? I stood there in the empty parking lot, my hands trembling. My first instinct was to report it, but what would I even say? That a guy who comes into the shop is creepy and left a weird note? It seemed like something the police would laugh off. So I convinced myself it was probably some sick joke. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The next few days were torture. Every time I walked into work, my stomach twisted, wondering if he'd be there. And sure enough, he was. Always sitting in the same spot, not ordering, just watching. It got to the point where I didn't even need to look up to feel his eyes on me. The tension was unbearable, but I still didn't say anything. Then the text started. I didn't recognize the number, but the messages were clear. Saw you today, one said. Another, you look tired. I felt a chill run through me every time my phone buzzed. Whoever was sending these messages knew exactly where I was. I knew it had to be him, but how could I prove it? I told a coworker about the situation, hoping for some advice, but they just shrugged it off, saying I was probably overthinking things. Maybe he's just shy, they said, laughing it off like it was no big deal. But it was a big deal. The texts, the notes, the way he followed me around, it was becoming too much. I tried changing my routine. I started taking different shifts, even leaving through the back exit, but it didn't matter. He still showed up. Sometimes I'd see him outside the shop, other times near my apartment. He never got too close, but he was always there, watching. I was trapped in my own life, and no one seemed to believe me. Desperate, I asked the manager to look into his loyalty card. Maybe there was something, some record of who he was, but when they checked the system, there was nothing. No DM, no trace of the man at all. It was like he didn't exist. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept checking my windows, convinced he was out there. I could almost feel his eyes on me through the darkness. Then, one day, as I was leaving work early, I saw him. He was standing by my car again, closer than ever before. Our eyes met, and I froze. My heart pounded in my chest, and I was sure he was going to approach me, but instead, he smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. It was mocking, like he knew exactly how scared I was. Then he just turned and walked away, leaving me standing there, paralyzed. I couldn't take it anymore. I knew I had to confront him. The next time he came into the shop, I was ready. He sat in his usual spot, staring as always. But this time, I walked up to him. My hands were shaking, but I forced myself to speak. Why are you doing this? Why are you following me? What do you want? He didn't flinch. He didn't even look surprised. He just stared at me with that same blank expression and said, I don't know what you're talking about. His voice was calm, almost amused. There was no guilt, no fear, nothing. He denied everything, like I was the crazy one. For a moment, I thought maybe I was imagining it all, but I knew better. I pushed harder. but he just stood up and walked out without another word. I chased after him, but when I got outside, he was gone. It was like he had disappeared into thin air. My heart was racing, and I felt more helpless than ever. He was real. I knew he was real. But now, he had vanished. After that day, he stopped coming in. At first, I felt relieved, but the fear didn't go away. I quit the job, hoping to escape the anxiety that followed me everywhere. I moved to a new apartment, blocked the number, tried to erase every trace of my old life. But even now, months later, I can't shake the feeling that he's still watching. Last week, I found another note. This time, it was under my apartment door. Just one word: soon. I haven't been able to sleep since. Every night I check the windows, lock the doors twice. Sometimes I wonder if he's been watching me all along, just waiting for me to let my guard down. It's been months, and I still don't feel safe. I don't think this is over. I take the bus to work every day. Same route, same stops, same routine. There's something comforting about the predictability of it all. My life is quiet, an office job that keeps me busy but never stressed. I always sit in the same seat near the back, minding my own business. But last week, something strange happened, and I can't stop thinking about it. It started as a normal day. I boarded the bus, found my seat, and settled in. That's when I noticed a guy sitting a few rows ahead. He kept glancing at me. I tried to ignore it, but the way his eyes lingered made me feel uncomfortable. I told myself it was nothing, just some weirdo, but it stuck with me. After a few stops, he got off, and I started to relax again. As I was getting off at my stop, I saw something on the seat next to me. A phone. It looked old. One of those older models that no one really uses anymore. I picked it up, thinking I'd hand it over to the driver or turn it in later. No big deal, right? That's when the messages started. As I stood there, waiting for the next bus to pull up, the phone buzzed. A text popped up on the screen. Please help me, I'm trapped. No name, no contact details, just that. At first I thought it was a prank, maybe some kid messing around. But then another message came through. I don't know how much time I have. Please, don't ignore this. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I looked around, half expecting to see someone watching me, but the street was empty. I hesitated, unsure of what to do. It felt like a joke, but something about the desperation in the messages made me uneasy. The phone buzzed again. Why aren't you helping? I'm going to die. I had no idea what to think. I checked the phone for any identification, but there was nothing. No saved contacts, no missed calls, nothing but these frantic texts. My stomach tightened. I didn't know what was going on, but I couldn't just ignore it. As I walked home, the phone kept buzzing in my pocket. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. The messages were relentless. You're my only hope. Please, don't leave me. They're coming. That's when I noticed something different. One of the texts had my name in it. I froze. Why aren't you helping me? My name. You're the only one who can. How the hell did it know my name? I hadn't put any information into the phone. My heart was pounding now, and I felt like someone was watching me. I glanced around again, but there was no one. Just the empty street, the soft hum of distant traffic. Still, the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. I thought about throwing the phone away, just leaving it on the sidewalk and walking off. But I couldn't. Something kept me from letting go. Maybe it was guilt, maybe it was fear. I don't know. Either way, I was stuck with it. When I got home, I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the phone. The messages hadn't stopped. You're my last chance. I can't hold on much longer. I felt sick. Part of me wanted to call the police, but what would I even say? That I found a phone with weird messages on it? They'd think I was crazy. Finally, I decided to answer. I typed out a message. Who are you? Where are you? My hands were shaking as I hit send, but before I could even see a response, the screen went black. The phone had died. I panicked. I plugged it into a charger, hoping it would come back to life, but nothing happened. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the phone and rushed to the police station. I had to get rid of it, to let someone else handle whatever this was. When I got to the station, I handed the phone to the officer at the front desk. I found this on the bus, I said. It's been getting these messages. I think someone's in trouble. The officer took the phone and looked at it. He powered it on, then handed it back to me with a shrug. There's nothing on it. No messages, no contacts. Maybe it's just broken. I stared at the blank screen, my heart sinking. How could that be? I'd seen the messages with my own eyes. I opened the messaging app. Empty. No messages at all. My mind was racing. Was it some kind of glitch? Was I losing it? Look, if you're worried, I can have someone check it out, the officer said, but I could tell he didn't think it was anything serious. I nodded, thanked him, and left. As I stepped outside, the phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, my hands shaking. A new message had come through. Too late. That night, I tried to convince myself it was all a joke, some weird prank that got out of hand. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I glanced out the window, I expected to see someone standing there, staring back at me. I didn't sleep much. The next day, I went through my routine as usual, but the paranoia was worse. Every person I passed on the street felt like they were watching me. I kept checking my phone, half hoping and half dreading another message. As I walked home that evening, the phone buzzed one last time. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't help myself. The message was short. I'm closer than you think. I rushed inside, locking the door behind me. I haven't left since. I don't know what to do. I keep checking the windows, the door, making sure everything is locked. I haven't seen anyone yet, but I know they're there. I can feel it. And now, the phone is buzzing again. The changing locks. I moved into my first apartment alone last year, and at first, everything seemed perfect. It was a small one-bedroom place in a quiet building, and I was excited to finally have my own space. I spent the first couple of weeks decorating, settling into a routine, and enjoying my independence. But not long after I moved in, I noticed small things that didn't feel right. The lock on my front door was always a little loose, and at night, I could sometimes hear faint noises in the hallway. I figured it was just my neighbors coming home late, but it still made me uncomfortable. One day after work, I came home and found my front door slightly ajar. I was sure I had locked it before leaving, but maybe I was just in a hurry that morning and forgot. I double-checked the lock before going to bed that night, convincing myself it was nothing. But from that moment on, I started to feel more cautious, checking the door more often, making sure it was fully locked. A week later, things escalated. I came home one evening and noticed scratches around the keyhole, like someone had been trying to pick the lock. My first thought was that maybe it was just wear and tear, but something about it didn't sit right with me. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard soft footsteps in the hallway. My heart started racing. The steps were slow, deliberate, like someone was standing right outside my door. I didn't dare get up to check. I lay there, listening, holding my breath, until the footsteps faded away. The next morning, I called the building manager and asked if there had been any break-ins or suspicious activity, but he just brushed me off. "You're safe here," he said. "The building's secure." I felt embarrassed for overreacting, but that uneasy feeling wouldn't go away. Over the next few days, I became obsessed with checking my door. Every time I left, I'd lock it, pull on the handle, and then double back to check it again. It didn't seem to matter though. A few days later, I saw more signs of tampering. This time, the lock felt different when I turned the key, like someone had tried to force it. I was getting more anxious by the day. Desperate for answers, I bought a cheap security camera and installed it outside my door, pointing right at the lock. I figured if someone was trying to get in, at least I'd catch them on camera. That night, I went to bed feeling a little more secure, but that didn't last long. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to a soft click, the unmistakable sound of someone trying to open the door. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound was quiet, like whoever was out there was being careful, but I could hear it clearly. Click, click. It was like they were trying different keys or picking the lock slowly. I didn't dare move. I stayed in bed, barely breathing, listening to the clicking. It felt like it went on forever, but eventually, the sound stopped. I stayed awake the rest of the night, too scared to fall back asleep. The next morning, I rushed to check the camera footage. My stomach dropped when I saw nothing. No one had been caught on camera. Either the person had been too quick, or the camera had malfunctioned. I was frustrated, confused, and most of all, terrified. I decided enough was enough. I replaced the lock with the most secure one I could find, hoping that would finally give me some peace of mind. For a few days, things were quiet. No signs of tampering, no strange noises at night. I started to relax, thinking maybe the whole thing had just been in my head. Then, one evening, I was reviewing the camera footage out of habit, and my blood ran cold. There he was, a man on the video, hunched over my new lock, trying to pick it. The footage was grainy, but I could make out his shape, tall and thin, methodically working on my door. My hands were shaking as I called the police. They came over, reviewed the footage, and took my statement. But they didn't seem very hopeful. The footage wasn't clear enough to identify him, and they couldn't do much more than tell me to stay vigilant. After the police left, I felt more vulnerable than ever. I kept thinking about how easily he'd gotten past my new lock, how close he'd been to getting inside. I couldn't sleep that night or the next. Every sound, every creak made me jump. The apartment, which had once been my safe space, now felt like a prison. I started to consider moving out, but the thought of leaving didn't bring much comfort. What if he found me again? What if this wasn't about the apartment but about me? I did eventually move, but the fear didn't go away. Even in my new place, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. Every knock at the door, every sound in the hallway sent my heart racing. I don't think I'll ever feel truly safe again. I'm sharing this here because I want others to be careful, to trust their instincts. If something feels off, it probably is. I don't know if that man is still out there, trying to find a way in, but I live with the fear that one day he might. The train ride home. I take the same late-night train home after work every day. I'm usually tired, and by the time I get to the station, it's almost empty. That's the one thing I've come to appreciate about my commute: the quiet. No crowds, just the low hum of the train as it glides along the tracks. But last night was different. It was quiet, yes, but not in the way I'm used to. There was something else in the silence, something off. At first, I didn't notice anything unusual. I found my seat, settled in, and stared out the window like I always do. The train wasn't completely empty when I got on. There were a few other people scattered about, but by the time we left the next station, I was alone. At least I thought I was. The train's rhythm should have been soothing, but it felt wrong, too slow, too still. I shifted in my seat, trying to shake off the unease, and that's when I saw him. Sitting at the far end of the car, perfectly still, staring directly at me. I don't know how I missed him when I got on. His face was partly in shadow, and he wasn't moving, not even slightly. Just sitting there, eyes locked on me. I told myself it was nothing. It's a public train. People ride it. Maybe he's just tired or zoned out. I tried to ignore the prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like someone was watching me too closely. I kept glancing out the window, hoping it would distract me. But my eyes were always drawn back to him. The train slowed as we approached another station. I waited for the usual sounds, people boarding, the doors opening, but no one came on. The stranger didn't move either. He just sat there, staring, and the silence stretched on. It was then I noticed I couldn't hear the train's usual hum anymore. No clattering, no mechanical whir, just the oppressive quiet. I started to wonder if he had been on the train before me. Had I seen him get on? My mind raced, trying to piece together the details. I couldn't remember. That didn't make sense. I should have noticed him. Then, without warning, he stood up. He didn't rush. His movements were slow, almost too slow, and deliberate. Step by step, he walked down the aisle toward me. My heart started pounding, and I gripped the seat's edge, trying to stay calm, but my breath hitched. Was he going to sit near me? Was he just getting off at the next stop? Each step he took felt like a countdown, and I kept calculating how far we were from the next station. Too far. I didn't know what to do. I thought about confronting him, but my throat felt tight, and my legs were too stiff to move. I couldn't bring myself to do anything but watch as he got closer and closer. Finally, the train slowed again, and the doors opened. I didn't wait. I bolted up, rushing through the doors onto the platform. I didn't even look back until I was safely off the train, breathing heavily. When I did glance back, I saw him, still standing inside, staring at me as the doors closed behind him. His eyes never left mine, even as the train rolled away, disappearing into the dark tunnel. I stood there for a moment, panting and trying to collect myself. It was over. It had to be over. But something didn't feel right. The platform was deserted, and the stillness from the train seemed to follow me here. I considered calling someone, maybe a friend, maybe the police, but what would I even say? That someone was staring at me? That didn't sound like a real threat, just something odd. I shook my head and waited for the next train. When it finally arrived, I got on, still feeling uneasy but convincing myself I'd left the worst behind. The new train was nearly empty too, but it felt safer, at least for a moment. I tried to relax, telling myself it was just a weird guy, and I'd overreacted. That was until we pulled into my home station. As the train slowed, I saw him, standing at the far end of the platform, staring directly at me. It couldn't be him. How could he have gotten here before me? My stomach dropped, and a cold wave of fear washed over me. I didn't think. I just ran. I bolted off the train and out of the station, my legs pumping as fast as they could, my mind screaming at me to get home, get somewhere safe. I didn't stop running until I reached my apartment. I slammed the door behind me, locked it, and leaned against it, my chest heaving. My mind was racing, replaying the events over and over, but none of it made sense. How had he gotten there? Was he following me? Was I imagining things? I moved to the window, peeking out from behind the curtain, half expecting to see him there. At first, nothing, just the empty street, the usual shadows. But then, across the road, I saw a figure standing under a street lamp. Even from that distance, I knew it was him. I pulled back from the window, my hands trembling. I didn't know what to do. Call the police? But for what? A man staring at me? I'd sound paranoid, irrational. Maybe I was. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the floor, every rustle of the wind outside made me jump. I kept checking the locks, peeking through the curtains. He wasn't there anymore, but that didn't matter. The fear stayed. It's been days now. I haven't seen him again, but I feel like I'm being watched. Every time I leave my apartment, I glance over my shoulder, expecting to see him lurking in the distance. I haven't taken the train since, but I can't shake the feeling that it's not over. I've always been the kind of person who enjoys solitude. After a bad breakup, I moved into a small house in a quiet suburban neighborhood. It was perfect. Just me, my books, and my work. I work from home, so my days are pretty calm. In the evenings, I'd unwind with Netflix or a good novel. The house is nothing special, but it's mine, and that was enough. I didn't know my neighbors very well, but that didn't bother me. The neighborhood felt safe. Until it didn't. It started a few weeks after I moved in. One night, as I was about to fall asleep, I heard a knock at my door. Just one. It was loud and clear. I checked the time, midnight. Half asleep, I stumbled to the front door, looked through the peephole, and nothing. No one was there. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe it was just kids playing a prank or I imagined it. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The knocking became a regular occurrence. Every night, right at midnight, one loud knock. Every time I checked, there was no one there. It started making me nervous. I'd get up, walk to each window, peek outside, and still see nothing. By the fourth night, I was convinced it wasn't just a prank. It was too consistent, too calculated. I tried to tell myself it was all in my head. Maybe it was some weird house noise, or I was overthinking it. But one night, the knocking changed. It wasn't a single knock anymore. It was a series of rapid, hard bangs, like someone was pounding on the door. My heart raced as I crept toward the peephole. Again, no one there. But this time, as I strained to look closer, I saw something. A shadow, standing just out of view, barely visible in the corner of my porch. My stomach dropped. The next day, I bought a security camera and installed it by the front door. I thought if I could catch whoever was doing this, it would all stop. That night, the knock came again. I ran to check the camera feed, but there was nothing. No one had come up to the door. The footage showed an empty porch. I played it back over and over, trying to find something, anything, but there was nothing. After that, I couldn't sleep. I stayed up, waiting for the knock, knowing it would come. My mind started playing tricks on me. I'd hear creaks in the floorboards or think I saw movement outside. I stopped turning the lights on at night, hoping whoever it was wouldn't know I was home. During the day, I noticed small things. My doormat moved slightly, smudges on the window, things I'd never paid attention to before. It felt like someone had been there, right outside, while I was away. I called the police, but without any real evidence, they brushed it off as kids messing around. I tried to believe them, but deep down, I knew this wasn't just some prank. I changed the locks on my door, but it didn't help the sinking feeling in my chest. A few nights later, the knocks came louder than ever before. I jumped out of bed, heart pounding, and went to the door. I expected it to stop as usual, but when I opened the door, I found something worse. A note had been slipped under the door. It read, "See you soon." That's when I realized this wasn't going to stop. I started spiraling. I barely slept. I stayed glued to the camera feed, but it never showed anything. The knocks would come faster, more urgent each night, and then, one night, they stopped completely. The silence was worse than the knocks. I stayed up all night sitting on the floor, gripping a kitchen knife, too scared to close my eyes. By morning, I forced myself to open the door and check outside. My mailbox was stuffed with crumpled pieces of paper. Each one had the same word scrawled across it, "Soon." I began barricading the door at night. Chairs, boxes, anything I could find to feel a little safer. But no matter how many locks I added or how high the pile in front of the door got, I couldn't escape the feeling that whoever was doing this was just waiting for the right moment. The police still didn't take me seriously. I felt completely alone. Then, just as suddenly as they started, the knocks stopped. Days passed with nothing, and for a while, I let myself think maybe it was over. But deep down, I knew better. One evening, I stepped outside to take out the trash, and when I turned to go back inside, I saw something move. A shadow, darting out of the corner of my eye. I froze. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I might faint. I didn't tell anyone. What would I even say? I installed more cameras, one in the back, two on the sides. The house was covered. I even thought about getting a dog, but I was scared I'd put it in danger too. Despite all the precautions, I still felt the weight of being watched. Every time I walked past a window, I swore I could feel eyes on me, just out of sight. I couldn't sleep unless the lights were on, but even then, I never slept deeply. One night, I got a notification from my security app. Someone was standing outside the front door, staring directly into the camera. I rushed to check the footage, but when I opened it, the video was corrupted. I couldn't see anything. By the time I went to the door, whoever it was had vanished. Now, I live in a state of constant fear. The knocks may have stopped, but the feeling of being watched hasn't. I'm thinking about moving, but part of me knows it won't matter. Whoever this is, they'll find me. They always do. I still check the door every night, just in case. The man in the window. I've always felt safe living on campus. I'm on the third floor of a busy dorm building, and my room has a huge window that overlooks the main street. The constant noise from cars, people walking by, and occasional sirens is something I've gotten used to. It feels comforting in a way, like the sounds of the city keep me connected to everything around me. But something changed recently. I didn't notice it at first, or maybe I just didn't think much of it. About a week ago, I saw a man standing on the sidewalk across the street, directly below my window. He was just standing there, not doing anything, just staring. At first, I figured he was waiting for someone, or maybe just resting for a moment, but the longer he stood there, the more uncomfortable I got. Still, I brushed it off. Big cities have their fair share of weird people, right? The next night, he was there again. Same time, same place. Just standing there, looking up. I tried to convince myself it was a coincidence, but every night after that, he kept coming back. He never moved, never walked away until long after I closed my blinds. I told my roommate about it, but she didn't seem too worried. "It's probably nothing," she said. "Just some random guy." Maybe she was right, but I started closing my blinds earlier each night, just in case. One night I was getting ready for bed and I felt this weird chill. I didn't want to look, but something made me pull back the edge of the curtain just a little. He was still there, but this time he was closer. He wasn't across the street anymore. He was right under my window, craning his neck up like he was trying to see me. That's when I started to panic. I grabbed my phone and called campus security. They told me they'd send someone to check it out, and a few minutes later, I saw the security car drive by. The man was gone. Security knocked on my door and told me they didn't see anyone. They said it was probably nothing to worry about, but I could tell they thought I was overreacting. I tried to calm down, but it didn't help much. The thought of him standing there, looking up at my window, sent a shiver down my spine. Over the next few days, I became hyper-aware of everything around me. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me, even when I wasn't near the window. During the day, I felt okay, but as soon as it got dark, the anxiety would creep in. I kept my blinds shut tight, barely peeking out now, and I started locking my door as soon as I got back to my room. I told a few friends about it, but they didn't seem to think it was a big deal. "He's probably just some creep," one of them said, laughing it off. If he does anything, call the cops. But it wasn't just some creep anymore. I saw him again a few nights later. This time, he wasn't just standing outside. He was closer, near the entrance to my dorm building. I didn't even bother calling security. By the time I ran downstairs to check, he had disappeared. The next morning, I woke up to a text from an unknown number. "I saw you last night. You look scared." I froze. I hadn't told anyone about what happened the night before, and I hadn't seen anyone who could have noticed me outside. My heart was racing as I stared at the screen, trying to figure out what to do. That's when I realized it wasn't just a man standing outside my window. He knew me. He had been watching me closely. I stayed up the next night, unable to sleep. I kept telling myself I'd confront him if he showed up again. At around 3 a.m., I peeked through the blinds, and sure enough, there he was. But this time, he wasn't outside. He was inside the building, standing just beyond the entrance to the dorms, staring directly at my window. I panicked. I grabbed my keys and rushed downstairs, determined to find him, but by the time I reached the lobby, he was gone. I tried to calm down, telling myself I was just imagining things, but when I went back to my room, I found my door slightly open. I know for a fact I locked it before I left. I stepped inside, trembling. I checked every corner of the room, but no one was there. I was about to call the police when I heard footsteps in the hallway. My heart was pounding as I quietly locked the door and looked through the peephole. He was walking down the hall, wearing a university staff badge. I couldn't make out his face clearly, but I knew it was him. He paused right in front of my door for a moment, and I felt my stomach drop. I called the police, but by the time they got there, he had vanished again. They searched the building, but no one found him. After that night, the police told me they'd increase patrols around campus, and the university added more security measures. For a while, I thought maybe it was over. Maybe he'd finally stop. But the truth is, I never felt safe again. I stayed in my room, always locking the door and checking the window. But even when my roommate was with me, I couldn't shake the fear that he was still out there, watching. It's been a few weeks now, and I haven't seen him again. But the fear hasn't gone away. I can't stop looking over my shoulder, and every small sound makes me jump. I've tried telling myself that he's gone, that the extra security scared him off. But last night, just as I was about to go to sleep, I heard a noise outside my window again. I'm too scared to check. Vanishing route. I've been a runner for as long as I can remember. It's my way of staying grounded, clearing my mind, and escaping the stress of everyday life. My favorite route was a quiet, scenic trail that wound through the woods near my neighborhood. I loved the stillness, just the sounds of birds, rustling leaves, and my own footsteps. The trail was usually empty, and I never had any reason to feel unsafe. I guess that's what made it so unsettling when I first got the feeling that someone was watching me. It wasn't anything obvious at first. A shiver down my spine, the prickling feeling of eyes on me, even though I was alone. I brushed it off, told myself it was just my imagination playing tricks because I was out there so early in the morning. Still, there was one thing I couldn't shake. The memory of a car I'd noticed parked near the trail a few weeks earlier. It hadn't seemed strange at the time, just someone stopping for a rest. But now, looking back, it felt like the first sign. One morning, I saw the car again. It was parked in a different spot, but it was the same make, same model. This time, there was a man inside, sitting motionless, staring straight ahead. I felt a wave of unease wash over me, but I told myself it was probably nothing. Maybe he was waiting for someone, or just taking a break. I kept running, but that uncomfortable feeling of being watched clung to me. Over the next few days, I started seeing the car more often. It would be parked at different spots along the trail, sometimes ahead of me, sometimes behind. No matter what time I went for my run, it was always there. The same man, always sitting inside, never getting out. I tried to rationalize it at first. Maybe he lived nearby and used the trail to relax. Maybe it was just a coincidence. But the more I saw him, the more deliberate it felt. I started changing my routine, running at different times, taking longer breaks to avoid the car. But it didn't help. Every time I returned, the car would be there, like it was waiting for me. Running, which had once been my escape, became something I dreaded. My heart would race before I even started, and not because of the exercise. One day, I decided to go later in the morning, hoping the car wouldn't be there. But as I rounded a bend, there it was, closer than ever before, almost like it had been waiting for me to change my routine. The man was still inside, but this time he got out. I froze. He didn't approach me. He just walked around to the back of the car, fumbling with something. I couldn't see what he was doing, and that only made my anxiety worse. My gut told me to run, to get out of there as fast as possible. I turned and sprinted back the way I came, my legs burning, heart pounding in my ears. I didn't stop running until I got home, slamming the door behind me. I locked every door and window, trying to convince myself I'd overreacted. Maybe he was just another person using the trail like I was. But the fear didn't go away. The next morning, I saw a news report about a woman who had gone missing near the same trail. My blood ran cold. Could it have been the same guy? Was I being paranoid, or had I just narrowly escaped something terrible? I decided to go to the police. I told them about the car, about the man who seemed to follow me, but they brushed me off. Without any real evidence, there wasn't much they could do. I left the station feeling frustrated, but more than that, terrified. That night, I did some digging online, looking up incidents near the trail. I found a few missing persons cases, all women, all within the past 2 years. It didn't feel like a coincidence anymore. That evening, while I was sitting in my living room, I glanced out the window. My heart dropped. The car was parked across the street from my house. I don't know how long it had been there, but the sight of it made me feel like I couldn't breathe. He'd followed me. He knew where I lived. Then, my phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. "See you tomorrow." I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I packed a bag and drove to a friend's house, desperate to feel safe somewhere. I tried to explain everything to her, but she was skeptical. "You're probably just overthinking it," she said. "You've been under a lot of stress. Just relax." But I couldn't relax. Every time I heard a car drive by, I jumped. Later that night, while lying on her couch, I heard it, the low rumble of a car engine idling outside. I didn't need to look out the window. I knew it was him. The next day, I made the decision to move. I packed up my things and found a new place in a different city, far away from the trail, far away from that car. For a while, I thought I was finally free of him. But last week, while driving through my new neighborhood, I saw it again. The same car, same make, same model, parked a few blocks away. I told myself it couldn't be him. It was just a coincidence. But deep down, I knew. He'd found me again, and I don't know what to do. The overnight shift. I've been working the night shift at this small, old hospital for about 6 months now. It's not the best place to be alone at night, but I needed the job. The night shift is always quieter, the lights dimmed, and the hallways practically empty. There's a sort of eerie stillness to it that I had mostly gotten used to. Sometimes you hear the old pipes creak or a door close when no one's around, but you get used to that too. Most nights it's just me and the security guard, and he usually leaves early. By midnight, I'm alone, making rounds in the dark, silent corridors. Lately, though, there had been some small things that were hard to ignore. At first, it was just faint tapping noises, almost like someone lightly knocking from inside the walls. I told myself it was nothing, just the building settling. Then, there were times when I felt watched, especially when walking down certain hallways. It wasn't something I could put my finger on, just a creeping sensation that made the back of my neck tingle. Still, I brushed it off. One night, I finished my shift and was walking to my car. I glanced up at the hospital building and something felt off. There was a light on in one of the upper windows. Nobody was supposed to be there. But I shrugged it off and drove home. Maybe someone had just forgotten to turn off a light. It wasn't until the first call that I started feeling uneasy. It was late, around 2 a.m., and I was at the nurse's station catching up on some paperwork. The phone rang, an unknown number. When I picked it up, there was just breathing. Deep, slow breathing. I said hello a few times, but no one responded. The line went dead after about a minute. I tried to tell myself it was probably just a prank, kids messing around. But then it happened again the next night. Same number. This time, the breathing was there. But it wasn't just that. There was a faint whisper, like someone trying to say something, but I couldn't make out the words. I hung up quickly, feeling a chill creep up my spine. I mentioned it to my boss the next day, and she just waved it off. Probably prank calls. Night shifts attract strange people sometimes, she said. But the calls kept coming. A few nights later, the phone rang again. I hesitated before answering. This time, the voice didn't just breathe. It said my name. Slowly, like they were enjoying it. I froze. It felt like ice water running through my veins. When I hung up, I just sat there, my heart pounding. Was someone watching me? I started feeling paranoid, checking over my shoulder every time I walked the halls. Even when I was at the nurse's station, I felt like someone was lurking just out of sight. I decided to check the security footage after my shift one night. I wanted to see if maybe I was overreacting, or if someone really was hanging around. But when I checked the camera feed, there were gaps. During the times the calls came in, the cameras covering my area were conveniently blank. No footage at all. I was more scared than I wanted to admit, but I kept telling myself I was imagining things. The night shift messes with your head, right? That's what everyone kept telling me. Then, one night, I got another call. This time, the voice said, "I'm watching you." Clear as day. My heart felt like it was going to explode out of my chest. I got up and started checking the rooms around me. Every door, every corner, I searched like my life depended on it. Each empty room made me feel worse, like the walls were closing in on me. The hospital felt emptier than ever. The few security guards we had weren't around, apparently busy dealing with something outside. I was completely alone. I noticed weird things too. Lights flickering more than usual, doors slightly ajar that I was sure I had closed. Every little thing felt like a sign that someone was there, just out of sight. I wanted to quit. I even looked into other jobs, but I couldn't just leave. I needed the money. I felt trapped, like no matter what I did, I couldn't get away from this horrible feeling. The final call came a few nights later. It was late, and the hospital was dead quiet. My phone rang, but this time, it wasn't the hospital line. It was my personal phone. I picked it up, my hand shaking. The same heavy breathing filled the line. Then the voice whispered, "I'm right behind you." I spun around, but no one was there. I bolted down the hall, almost slipping on the polished floor. In my panic, I saw something, a shadow moving just at the edge of my vision. I ran to the security office, but it was empty. I locked myself in a supply closet, trying to calm my racing heart. Who was doing this? How could they be inside the hospital without being seen? I thought about calling the police, but I doubted anyone would believe me. I had no proof. My phone rang again. I almost dropped it. This time, The voice said my name again, slow and deliberate, and then added, "I see you." There was a sound outside the door. Footsteps, soft but unmistakable, slowly coming closer. I held my breath, not daring to move. The footsteps stopped just outside the closet. After a long minute, I worked up the courage to open the door. The hallway was empty, but the air felt wrong, like someone had just been there. I didn't finish my shift that night. I left the hospital as soon as I could, and I never went back. I emailed my resignation the next day. Even after leaving, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still watching me. At night, I would hear faint breathing or footsteps outside my apartment. Whenever I checked, though, no one was there. I'm still haunted by what happened at that hospital. The calls stopped, but the fear never did. I avoid hospitals now, but I always wonder, who was watching me from inside that night? As I finish writing this, my phone buzzes. It's an unknown number calling again. The misplaced keys. I don't usually post things like this, but it's been bothering me ever since it happened. I guess I just need to get it off my chest, and maybe someone here can make sense of it. Anyway, here goes. It was a Friday night, just like any other. I work a typical 9 to 5, and by the end of the week, I'm usually pretty drained. That night, I decided to stop by my usual bar for a drink or two before heading home. I live alone, so it's my little way of unwinding. Before I left the house, I did my usual routine, checked my pockets to make sure I had my keys, phone, wallet. I distinctly remember feeling the keys in my pocket. It's a habit of mine, something I do without thinking. As I headed out, I thought I heard something, a faint creak, like a door shifting in the wind. But my place is old and it makes noises all the time. I didn't think much of it. The night at the bar was pretty normal. I had a couple of beers, chatted with the bartender, scrolled through my phone. It wasn't busy, and I was enjoying the quiet. A couple of hours passed, and I decided it was time to head home. I reached into my pocket for my keys. Nothing. I tried the other pocket. Still nothing. I sat there for a second, trying to remember if I'd taken them out at any point, but I was sure I hadn't. I'd had them when I left the house. Panic started to creep in. I checked under the bar stool, asked the bartender if anyone had turned in a set of keys, even retraced my steps to the bathroom. Nothing. They were gone. I was certain I hadn't lost them outside the bar because I hadn't gone anywhere else. It didn't make sense. The bartender, seeing my frustration, tried to help me look around, but after 10 minutes, it was clear they weren't there. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I had this strange thought that maybe someone had taken them, but that didn't make sense either. The bar wasn't crowded, and no one had been sitting near me. Still, the unease gnawed at me. Eventually, I had no choice but to call a friend to drive me home. They dropped me off, gave me a weird look when I told them I'd have to break in through a side window, but I shrugged it off. I was too tired to explain. Breaking into my own house wasn't exactly how I'd planned to end the night, but it was the only option. The window wasn't too hard to pry open, but as I climbed inside, I couldn't shake this feeling that I was being watched. The house felt still, too still, and cold. I told myself I was just being paranoid after the whole key fiasco. I walked into the kitchen, and that's when I froze. My keys. They were sitting right there on the counter, as if I'd left them out before I went to the bar. But I knew I had them with me when I left. I felt the cold metal in my pocket as I locked the door behind me. I just stood there, staring at them, my heart pounding. I tried to calm down, telling myself maybe I'd been stressed and forgot them, but the more I thought about it, the less sense it made. I searched the house, every room, every corner. I checked the doors, the windows, everything was locked. No sign of anyone else having been there. But how did my keys get back inside? That's when the fear really started to settle in. I tried to sleep, but every noise in the house seemed louder, sharper. The floorboards creaking, the ticking of the clock. It all sounded wrong. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been in my house, maybe still was. After a couple of hours, I got up. I couldn't stand it anymore. I grabbed a kitchen knife and went through the house again, room by room, opening closets, checking under the bed. Nothing. No one. I kept telling myself I was being ridiculous, that I was overreacting, but I couldn't stop thinking about the keys. At one point, I walked to the front window and peeked through the curtain, half expecting to see someone standing outside in the dark. Of course, there was nothing, just the empty street. But the paranoia wouldn't go away. I even thought about calling the police, but what would I say? My keys were in the wrong place. They'd think I was crazy. Just as I was about to sit down and try to calm myself, there was a knock at the door. My whole body went cold. It was the middle of the night. Who would be knocking at my door at this hour? I stood there, frozen, gripping the knife in my hand, staring at the door. I don't know how long I stood there before I worked up the courage to open it. Slowly, I unlocked the deadbolt and cracked the door open, just enough to peek outside. No one. There was no one there. My stomach dropped. I shut the door and locked it again, backing away slowly. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the couch, knife in hand, waiting for the sun to come up. When the first light of dawn filtered through the windows, I finally let myself relax a little. I must have passed out for a couple of hours because when I woke up, the house was eerily quiet again. I tried to convince myself that I'd just misplaced my keys. Maybe I was so tired that I'd forgotten them on the counter after all. But as I reached for my phone on the kitchen counter, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The keys, they were moved slightly, just a few inches from where they'd been last night. I haven't slept properly since. Was someone in my house that night? Or was it all in my head? I don't know, but I haven't felt safe in my own home since. The hotel room across the hall. I travel a lot for work, usually staying in random hotels for a few nights at a time. It's not the most exciting routine, but I've gotten used to it. This particular trip felt like any other. Check into a hotel, work late, grab a quick dinner, and go back to the room. The hotel was nothing fancy, just a standard business place with bland carpets and quiet hallways. But it was clean and convenient, so I didn't think much of it. From the start, though, something about the room across the hall caught my attention. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but the people staying there were strange. They didn't make eye contact, never spoke in the hallway, and always seemed to leave and return at odd hours. Every time they came back, they were carrying large duffel bags, no matter the time of day. I remember thinking it was odd, but I shrugged it off. People have their own routines, right? The first time I heard the noise, it was late, maybe around 2 a.m. I had just gotten into bed when a muffled scream came from across the hall. It was faint, like it had been smothered under something. I sat up immediately, my heart racing. For a minute, I just sat there, listening, but the sound was gone as quickly as it came. I told myself it was probably nothing, a tea maybe, or someone playing around. Still, I couldn't shake the unease that settled over me. I stayed awake for a long time that night, listening for any other strange noises, but everything was quiet. The next day, I couldn't stop thinking about the room. I passed by it on my way to the elevator, but the door was shut, and nothing seemed out of the ordinary. I considered asking the front desk about it, but I didn't want to seem paranoid. It was probably just my imagination. But that night, it got worse. Around midnight, I started hearing strange sounds again. Thumping, like something heavy was being moved, and muffled voices. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but there was something about the tone. It didn't sound right. And then, what sounded like crying, soft but constant. I sat up in bed, frozen, my hand hovering over my phone. Should I call someone? Hotel security? The police? What if it was just a domestic argument or something? I didn't want to overreact, so I stayed in bed, listening. The sounds didn't stop though, and just as I was about to call the front desk, I heard the door across the hall creak open. I jumped out of bed and looked through the peephole. One of the people from the room was dragging another one of those duffel bags down the hall. The bag was large, too big for just clothes. It made a soft scraping sound as it slid along the carpet. The shape of it, something about it didn't sit right with me. But just like that, they were gone, and the hallway was silent again. I couldn't sleep after that. I kept watching the door through the peephole, waiting for something else to happen. Over the next couple of days, I tried to act normal. I worked, went about my day, but every time I passed that room, I felt a chill run down my spine. I couldn't ignore it anymore. There was something wrong. The people staying there acted too strange. They left for long stretches at night and always returned with the same duffel bags. The noises never stopped either. Sometimes it was soft crying. Other times, loud bangs like furniture being knocked over. Finally, I decided to ask the front desk. I casually mentioned the noises and the odd behavior from across the hall. The receptionist just gave me a polite smile and said, "We haven't received any complaints from other guests." They didn't seem to care. I felt stupid for even bringing it up, but that night, the sounds were louder than ever. It was like something, or someone, was being dragged across the floor. The crying was unmistakable now, and with it, a rhythmic banging, like fists pounding on a wall. I grabbed my phone, ready to call the police, but just as I looked through the peephole again, the hallway was completely empty. No one was there. No duffel bags, no people, just silence. I didn't know what to do. Should I go out and knock on the door myself? I was terrified, my mind racing with all kinds of horrible possibilities, but I couldn't move. The next morning, I finally snapped. I went straight to the hotel manager and told them everything. The noises, the duffel bags, the strange people. I insisted they check the room. They gave me a confused look and said something that chilled me to my core. That room has been vacant for weeks. I couldn't believe it. I felt dizzy, like the ground had been pulled out from under me. Vacant? That didn't make sense. I had seen people going in and out. I had heard the noises. Security checked the room anyway, and when they came back, they said it was completely empty. No signs that anyone had been there. No bags, no nothing. I went back to my room, my head spinning. What the hell was going on? That night, as I lay in bed, the noises started again. This time, they were louder, more desperate. The thumping, the crying, the banging on the walls. I locked my door and stayed under the covers, trembling, too afraid to even breathe. Then, just before dawn, I heard a single knock on my door. My heart stopped. I didn't dare move. The knock came again, slow and deliberate. After a long, agonizing pause, I heard footsteps retreating down the hall. I checked out that morning, not even bothering to look back as I left the hotel. But as I drove away, something caught my eye in the rearview mirror. Someone was standing at the window of the room across the hall, watching me leave. I haven't stopped thinking about that trip. I've looked for news articles, police reports, anything that could explain what happened, but I've found nothing. It haunts me. Was I imagining things? Or was something much worse happening right under my nose? I still don't know the answer. But I can't shake the feeling that it's not over. The wrong Uber. I'm not the type to scare easily. I've been in cities my whole life, and you learn to stay aware of your surroundings. But what happened to me last week? I haven't slept properly since, and every time I close my eyes, I keep thinking how close I came to. I don't even want to finish that sentence. It started like any other Friday night. I was out with a couple of friends at a bar downtown. It wasn't a wild night, just a few drinks, catching up, the usual. By midnight, I was ready to head home. I was a bit tipsy, but still in control. I've always been careful, especially when I'm alone, so like always, I ordered an Uber. I stood outside the bar, scrolling through my phone while waiting for the car. It was chilly and the street was quieter than usual. A few people walked by, but no one stood out. Well, except for this one guy leaning against the wall nearby, smoking. He kept glancing at me, which made me a little uncomfortable, but I brushed it off. People are weird sometimes. A car pulled up to the curb. I glanced at the app. It was supposed to be a gray Honda Civic. The car in front of me was gray, and the plate was close enough. My brain, slightly fogged by the alcohol, didn't think too much about the mismatch. I walked over and opened the door. "Uber for Sarah?" I asked. The driver nodded, barely looking at me. I got in. At first, everything seemed fine. The guy was quiet, which I actually appreciated. No awkward small talk. I pulled out my phone, texting my friend to let her know I was on my way home. But as we drove, something started to feel off. He wasn't following the usual route. I knew the streets pretty well, and I'd taken this ride from downtown to my place a dozen times. This wasn't the right direction. I glanced at the GPS on my phone. It was still open, showing my destination, but we were going the opposite way. My stomach tightened. I told myself it was nothing, probably a detour for traffic or something. But I kept watching the screen, and the little blue dot kept moving further away from where I lived. "Hey, are we taking a different route?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. The driver didn't respond right away. He just kept his eyes on the road, his grip on the steering wheel tightening. Then, without looking at me, he mumbled something like, "Shortcut." That's when the real fear started creeping in. I double-checked the app. The profile picture didn't match the guy driving. My heart started pounding in my chest, and I could feel the panic rising. I tested the door handle. It didn't budge. "Hey, I think there's a mistake. Can you just pull over? I'll get out here." Silence. He didn't even glance in my direction. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. I opened my phone, pretending to call someone, hoping it might make him nervous. "Yeah, I'm almost home," I said loudly, praying he'd hear. "I'll be there in 5 minutes." No reaction. The car was now heading into a more isolated area, where the streets were darker and there were fewer buildings. My hands were shaking. Every possible scenario played in my head, none of them good. I tried the door again, but it still wouldn't open. That's when I saw it. A red light up ahead. The car would have to stop. This was my chance. As the car slowed down, I knew I had only a few seconds to act. My heart was racing, and my palms were sweaty, but I had no choice. The second the car stopped, I shouted, "Let me out!" The driver's head slowly turned toward me. His face was expressionless, almost too calm. He reached over like he was going to grab my arm, or maybe try to calm me down, but I wasn't waiting to find out. I lunged forward, manually unlocking the door. My body was already moving before I even processed what I was doing. I threw myself out of the car, stumbling onto the sidewalk. My knees scraped the concrete, but I didn't stop. I ran, sprinting towards a gas station a block away, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't look back until I made it inside. The driver sped off without a word, just gone. Inside the gas station, I collapsed near the counter, shaking so hard I could barely speak. The cashier looked at me like I was crazy, but I didn't care. I asked him to call the police, and we did. But when they arrived, there wasn't much they could do. I didn't have the guy's license plate, and the car wasn't registered on the app. All I had were my hazy memories and the lingering feeling that I'd just barely escaped something terrible. I thought that was the end of it. I tried to move on, to convince myself that maybe I'd overreacted. Maybe it wasn't as bad as I thought. But a few days later, I saw a news article about women going missing in my city. Women who were last seen getting into cars they thought were their Ubers. That's when it hit me. I wasn't overreacting. I could have been one of them. Even now, I can't stop thinking about it. What if I hadn't jumped out at that stoplight? What was he planning to do? And more than anything, I wonder, is he still out there, picking up someone else? I don't think I'll ever use Uber again. And I definitely won't forget the look on his face. The calm, almost bored look, like he'd done this before, like he'd do it again. The silent apartment neighbor. I moved into this apartment about 6 months ago. It was supposed to be a fresh start, new city, new job, and a quiet place all to myself. The rent was surprisingly affordable, and the location was great, close to work and public transport. It seemed like a perfect fit for someone like me who keeps to themselves. I'm pretty introverted, so I didn't expect to make friends with the neighbors or anything, just a peaceful place to live. But from the moment I moved in, something felt off about my new place. The building was mostly quiet, which I didn't mind at first, but it was too quiet, especially the apartment next to mine. I never heard anything from there. Not footsteps, not the TV, not even voices. It was like no one lived there at all. At first, I thought maybe the place was vacant, but I'd seen the door open once when I was moving in, and I was sure I saw a person, a woman, I think, standing inside. A few days after settling in, I found a note slipped under my door. It was written on a scrap of paper in shaky handwriting. "Stay quiet at night." That was all it said. At first, I thought it was some passive-aggressive way of telling me to keep the noise down, but I wasn't exactly loud to begin with. I didn't even own a TV, and I always wore headphones when I listened to music. It made no sense. I tried to brush it off, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. Every time I passed by the door of the apartment next to mine, I'd hesitate, listening for any sounds of life. Nothing. Not even the faintest creak of the floor. The silence became suffocating. I kept telling myself it was just an overly sensitive neighbor, but the wording of the note bothered me. Why tell me to stay quiet at night? Was it a warning? Things escalated a week later. It was around 2 a.m. when I woke up to a loud thudding noise coming from the apartment next door. It was rhythmic, like something heavy being slammed against the wall. My heart raced as I lay there listening, but there was no other sound, no voices, no shuffling, just that eerie thudding. I debated getting up and knocking on their door, but something about the situation made me freeze. After what felt like forever, the noise just stopped, and the silence came back, heavier than before. I see. The next morning, I walked past their door on my way to work, but it looked the same as always, closed, undisturbed, like no one had been in or out for days. The whole thing was starting to make me anxious. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, but I wasn't sure what. As the days went on, I started paying more attention to that apartment. I found myself standing by my door, listening, waiting for any sign of movement. Then one evening, I saw it. A figure standing inside through the small gap in the curtains. It was just a silhouette, barely visible, but it was there. Someone was definitely in there. But why did they never leave? Why was it so silent all the time? That night, the thudding came back. This time, it was louder and more frantic, like something, or someone, was being thrown against the wall repeatedly. My heart pounded as I sat up in bed, clutching the blankets, my ears straining to hear anything else. But again, there was nothing, just the horrible thudding noise, and then silence. I couldn't take it anymore. I got up, threw on a jacket, and decided I was going to knock on their door. I knocked once, lightly, but there was no answer. I knocked again, harder this time, my knuckles shaking against the wood. Still nothing. Desperate for some kind of explanation, I grabbed the door handle and turned it. To my surprise, it was unlocked. My stomach dropped, and for a moment, I thought about pushing the door open. But a cold, creeping dread held me back. I couldn't bring myself to do it. The next night I woke up again, but this time, the thudding was mixed with something else. A dragging sound, like furniture being pulled across the floor. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I needed to know what was happening next door. I got up, marched to the door, and this time I didn't hesitate. I pushed it open. The apartment was a mess. Chairs were overturned, papers scattered everywhere, and a broken lamp lay in the middle of the floor. The place smelled terrible, like something rotting, though I couldn't pinpoint what. But what really hit me was the emptiness. There was no one there. No sign of the neighbor, no personal belongings, nothing that indicated someone had lived there for long. It looked like they had left in a hurry, abandoning everything. My chest tightened as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed something near the door, a note, the same shaky handwriting as before. You should have stayed quiet. I stumbled back to my apartment, locked the door, and called the police. When they arrived, they searched the apartment, but they didn't find anything. No sign of the neighbor, no clues, nothing. They brushed it off, saying maybe the tenant had moved out without notice, though I knew that wasn't the case. I told them about the noises, the notes, but they didn't seem concerned. I felt crazy. The worst part? That night, after the police left, I heard the thudding again. But this time, it wasn't coming from next door. It was coming from inside my own walls. I couldn't stay there after that. I moved out as soon as I could, but even now, in my new apartment, I can't shake the feeling that I'm still being watched. Late at night, when everything's quiet, I swear I hear faint thuds, just like before. I don't know if it's in my head or if the horror followed me. But every time I hear it, I check the door, waiting for the silence to break again. And I wonder if I should have stayed quiet. End.